Butterfly Kisses. Written by Melanie Jacobson. Narrated by Andrea Coomer. Chapter 1. Ridley Lansing shifted his Jeep into fourth gear and appreciated that the classic Mustang convertible in front of him was going the speed limit. That was the perfect way to drive the Pacific Coast Highway. Too fast, and it meant the gorgeous expanse of the Pacific flew by. Too slow, and it was totally inconsiderate of the long line of cars behind you on the narrow highway. Even more than the Mustang's speed, he appreciated its mint condition. Candy apple red, of course. A 65 should never be any other color. Although if someone offered Ridley a black one, he wouldn't say no. But almost as much as he liked the paint job, he liked the contrast of the dark gold hair streaming out in a wild ponytail behind the driver's head. He framed a shot in his mind, the title forming as clearly as the picture, Classic Summer. He couldn't see much beyond the graceful line of her neck and the relaxed set of her lightly tanned shoulders. But he'd caught her profile once when she'd glanced toward the waves, and she seemed to be his age. Part of him wished he was 10 years younger, when his more reckless college self might have stepped on the accelerator and sped up to catch her eye. Then maybe her phone number. He contented himself with enjoying the sight of a carefree woman exploring PCH the right way. No, almost the right way. She'd need a surfboard jutting out of her convertible for the picture to be perfect. The sign for his exit came up, and he moved to the far right lane, amused when the driver ahead of him did too. Good. He'd get to enjoy the enhanced view for a few more minutes. When she took the same exit, he smiled. The gods of summer had his back today. At the bottom of the ramp, he strained for a glimpse of her in her rearview mirror, but only caught the graceful sweep of her eyebrows over her sunglasses. Aviators. Hot. He was a sucker for women in aviators. Her hand darted toward her radio and cranked up the volume knob. And just like that, she was holding a private dance party in the driver's seat, her ponytail now bobbing wildly as she bounced along to the song. He turned down his own radio and heard the Rolling Stones pouring out of her car. Of course. Of course a hot woman in aviators and a classic Mustang would love the Stones. He watched her, a slow grin overtaking him as she rocked out, flinging her arms into the air as Mick Jagger howled a high note. A passing car honked its horn and she jumped, setting her hands back on the steering wheel. She glanced into her rearview mirror, her eyes seeming to lock with his before she shrugged and went back to her car dancing, obviously deciding not to care what anyone else thought. She was having fun, and he realized he was too. Too bad his perfect woman would disappear when the light changed. She paused and held up her phone for a second, flicking a quick glance at the map on the screen. She had a California license plate, but the fact that she was using GPS meant she wasn't from Seashell Beach. Good, because he'd hate to think he'd been blind to a woman like this in his own backyard. The light changed and they pulled out, a smooth tandem heading west. But when she flipped her signal for a left turn onto Tangerine, a hum of awareness ran along his nerve endings. It was the same sensation he got when a wave swelled way out, but he knew before it formed that it was going to give him his best photo of the day. Sure enough, the next time her signal blinked, it was to turn into the Mariposa Hotel guest's driveway. Oh man, she was in his territory now, and he was going to take full advantage of it. He passed her and swung into the far side of the self-park lot to get a good view of the waves and watched for several minutes. Still soft. Good. That meant the organizers wouldn't be running any heats he had to shoot. He had time to run into the hotel and grab a bite at the Sandpiper. The spacious lobby was more full than he'd thought it could get, and he had to dodge a bellhop pushing a cart of designer luggage toward the elevator. Ridley checked his watch. Almost 3, so that meant people were checking in. Brent wouldn't have time for a chat. He weaved his way to the other side of the lobby, dodging more guys and several women looking more impatient than 24 people in resort clothes should look. "Ridley!" He turned at the sound of Brent's voice and backtracked to where his friend stood in his navy blazer, with his name and general manager title pinned to its breast pocket. "Rough day?" Ridley asked as Brent jerked his head at another bellhop while keeping a calm smile on his face. "You could say that," Brent gritted through his teeth. "Our turnover time is not on point today, and we've got a big plastic surgery conference checking in. I've also got a concierge out with the flu, or a daughter with the flu, or he flew somewhere. I don't know. I couldn't hear him over the panic in my head when he said he wasn't coming in today." He eyed the restless vacationers shifting from foot to foot while they stood in the check-in lines and cast bored glances around the hotel. "This group is going to want entertaining, and Marco's my best for handling them." He pinched the bridge of his nose and straightened his smile. "I'll do it," Ridley said. Brent shook his head. "You don't have to. I know you were heading into the Sandpiper for some grub. Go." "It's not a big deal. It'll be like the good old days." 12 years ago, they'd been students at UC Santa Barbara, working nights at one of the city's most exclusive hotels. Brent worked at the registration desk as experience for his major in hotel management. Ridley had worked at the concierge desk because telling people where to find interesting stuff to do in the city was more his thing. He'd always had a knack for finding cool stuff. Brent groaned as a bellhop sent half the luggage on the cart sliding off. Ridley snorted. "Go. I'll play concierge." Brent nodded. "Uniform is in the employee locker room. Just check the racks with the clothes and dry cleaning bags. You know which one you need?" "Hawaiian shirt, dark blue with white palm leaves?" "Yeah, thanks." Brent glanced over the line backing up at the registration desk. "Major thanks, actually. Your room this week is on me." "Not necessary, dude." Ridley's place was only a few miles from the hotel. A raised voice from the guest at the front of the check-in line sent both of Brent's eyebrows up. "Yeah, it is. You're covering the Pro-Am surf contest, right? Save yourself the hassle of finding beach parking every morning and stay here. Now get to work." Ridley grinned and saluted while Brent headed toward the registration desk. Ridley went the opposite direction, down the north corridor to the door discreetly marked Service. He hadn't been past it before, but he easily identified the employee changing room and rifled through the rack of dry-cleaned backup uniforms, pulling down a crisp Hawaiian shirt his size. It looked ridiculous with his worn-out cargo shorts, perfectly broken in to fit his lenses and filters. Brent was right. If Ridley was going to have to put on the starched khaki shorts that went with the Aloha shirts for a whole evening, he definitely deserved to have his room comped for the week. 10 minutes later, he was behind the concierge desk, watching Brent coach his registration clerks in a low voice and casting enough apologetic glances to the waiting guests that Ridley could see the tension leaving their shoulders. For the next hour, Ridley didn't have to do more than call in a reservation for a doctor and his wife at Ridley's favorite seafood restaurant, and book another guest a spa package for the next morning. By then, the bustle in the lobby had quieted to a thrum, a steady but manageable stream of check-ins of plastic surgeons coming in for the conference. It was hard to tell whether the middle-aged men had facelifted wives who'd availed themselves of their husbands' skills, or girlfriends who hadn't started fighting gravity yet. He personally liked character in a face, imperfections that told stories, tiny lines that suggested living. He winced as a woman passed his desk on the way to her room, her hand tucked into her husband's arm, her skin stretched drum-like over her cheekbones. She gave him LA flashbacks. He hated having to go down there to shoot, but it was almost unavoidable when two of the top-rated U.S. surfers came out of Venice and Malibu. Malibu was bad. Half the women over 50 looked like their faces had frozen at age 30 in a Madame Tussauds kind of way. He people-watched for another hour, answering a few questions and booking another reservation, but it didn't take long for the rush to die down. He was about to text Brent, who had disappeared to handle something urgent elsewhere, that he was going to leave, when a flash of dark gold caught his eye, and he looked up to see the Mustang girl crossing the lobby. Now he could see her fitted jeans and worn flip-flops as she strode to the reservation desk with the confidence he liked. No coy strutting, just a brisk, business-like walk. She leaned over to talk to the clerk and ran her fingers through her hair. It was messy, he noticed, with streaks the color of corn silk. He wondered if she owed those to the sun or a salon. The sun, he decided, the second she turned around and he could see her face fully. She didn't have a stitch of makeup on, and she was gorgeous. Big dark eyes and a heart-shaped face gave her a sexy girl-next-door vibe. Now that he could see her better, he'd put her age at a little younger than his. Maybe 30, tops. When she headed toward the elevators, an impulse he couldn't explain made him open his mouth and call halfway across the lobby. "Welcome to the Mariposa." It startled her. He could see it in her confused expression when she glanced his way. "Thank you," she said, her tone polite. She didn't stop, and he wanted her to. He couldn't peg her. Maybe she was here to meet someone. A boyfriend? Or friends for a girls' weekend. She wasn't with the convention and didn't look like she was a side piece for any of the doctors. She wasn't glossed, plucked, and augmented enough. "I'm Ridley," he said when she kept going. She paused. "I'm the concierge on duty tonight. Can I help you with anything?" He wished he could come up with a better leading question to figure out why she was staying at the hotel, but at least he'd gotten her to stop for a minute. "Thanks, Ridley. I'm fine, though." A smile peeked through, like she was enjoying a joke she didn't want to share with anyone. "What I need, I don't think you can give me, but I appreciate the offer." "Try me," Ridley heard himself say. "I'm in the market for a miracle," she said, her smile fading a tiny bit. "Got any of those lying around?" "Fresh out," he said, hating that he couldn't tell her yes. He scooped up the binder of brochures Marco kept to help the guests. "I do have horseback riding, wine tasting, chocolate making, and parasailing." He tapped an empty plastic sleeve and gave her a sad look. "Someone already took the miracle we had in stock." She laughed, and it lit up her face. "Then I guess all I need right now is a nap. Which binder are those in?" Ridley slumped and rested his chin in his hand. "I feel like a failure. Please think of something I can do for you so I don't get fired." She shook her head. "All right. I could use some intelligent company this evening." Ridley straightened. He was intelligent. "If Tom Hiddleston turns up," she continued, "point him in my direction. Otherwise, you're off the hook. If anyone asks, I'll tell them you tried really hard. You should definitely keep your job." "Tom Hiddleston?" "Yeah, he's an actor. Maybe you saw him in Avengers. He's Loki." Ridley quirked an eyebrow at her. "I'd have known him as F. Scott Fitzgerald, too." That sent both of her eyebrows up. Midnight in Paris reference? Nice. I love that movie. That was before Tom Hiddleston was even a thing. I didn't know he was a thing. I just thought he was a good actor. He's both. He's the thinking woman's Brad Pitt. She gave him a tired smile this time. "I need to get to my room now. Don't worry. So far, the customer service has been fantastic." I'll tell any official-looking people so." She walked away, heading toward the elevator, and Ridley watched her go. One lesson he'd learned about living in a resort town was that the relationships were never permanent, and the more drawn he was to someone, the worse it was when they left. He wasn't the kind of guy to get overly attached too soon, but every now and then he struck a different connection with a woman, a distinct spark that was rare. Those 2 or 3 had never turned into anything, despite the best intentions on both sides. It was much smarter to stay away from the girls who flitted through the hotel like the butterfly it was named for. They weren't designed to stay long, and he was fine with that. It was plenty of fun to play if an especially pretty one drifted through his orbit in the Sandpiper, the restaurant on the hotel's beach side, and lighted next to him for a drink and some company. There wasn't much to say after the small talk, but that didn't bother him. Still, he walked over to the registration counter, stopping in front of the clerk who had checked the woman in. "Hey, Celeste," he said, reading her name tag. "What's that guest's name? The one you just helped?" Celeste tapped a few keys. "Brooke Dresden. She came in 2 hours late from LA. That surprised him. Maybe she was one of those granola yoga-y types that popped up in LA every now and then. "Do you need her room number?" "Yes. I need to send something up for her." Celeste read it off to him, and he returned to his post, pulling out his cell phone to call Brent. "Everything okay?" Brent asked. "You ready to be off the hook? It's probably slow enough that I can have the front desk keep an eye on the concierge stand." "Everything's fine," Ridley said. "But I need to do something for one of the guests before I go, and I need to log on to the computer here to do it." Brent gave him the staff login and password and tried to send him home again. "Dude, you saved me. Go pack a bag and tell Celeste we're comping you a room on the top floor. It's yours all week. Don't say no." Ridley hesitated, but then thought about the surf report for the next 3 days. "I'll take it," he said. "There are a lot of early starts this week. I wouldn't mind being able to walk out of the back door and start shooting." "Sweet. I'm glad. And now I'm going to go back to figuring out the concierge thing for the week. Turns out it was Marco's daughter, and she's got the flu. I guess he can't leave her at daycare. I can't blame him, but I do have to cover for him. Wish me luck." "Luck," Ridley said. "Also, I make this Aloha shirt look good, so if I've got time, I'll jump in again." "I'm comping your room service too," Brent said before hanging up on Ridley's laugh. Ridley logged onto the computer and executed a quick Google search before finding what he needed and printing it off. What the lady wants, the lady gets. After all, the Mariposa was all about customer service. His was about to be 5-star worthy. Chapter 2. Brooke lifted her suitcase to the pristine white bed cover, but instead of opening it and digging out the dress she should be sliding into, she collapsed onto her back and let her eyes drift shut. She'd learned the art of the power nap at work, and she needed one now. It was stupid that a drive up the coast highway could wear her out more than a full day on the job, but it had. What should have taken 3 hours ended up 5 with all the traffic. She'd teased the cute concierge downstairs, but honestly, the only thing that had made the drive bearable was the audiobook she'd been listening to most of the way. It was a James Bond novel, actually, and Brooke liked James Bond fine. Beyond fine if it was Daniel Craig, but she'd mainly picked the book because it was Tom Hiddleston reading it to her. If only she really could conjure her favorite actor out of thin air to be her dinner date. They could go to a third-rate dive, and it would be a massive improvement over the company she'd be dealing with tonight, even with fancy hotel catering. She dozed for 30 minutes before her annoyingly precise internal clock forced her to get up and dig out the dress she needed. Her hand hovered over her favorite cotton tank dress. If it was up to her, she'd slip into it and curl up by the pool with a burger and a book. Remember the goal. She reached past it and fished out her cocktail dress, a designer sheath in a bold geometric print any fashion connoisseurs would recognize on sight. It was important to appear affluent to these people, to look as if she belonged in their circles. They would be quick to close ranks on any perceived outsiders. That could be the theme of her entire 20s, really. You don't belong to this class. She checked her reflection in the mirror, glad she'd matched the straps of her tank top to the straps of her dress while she'd driven with the top down. The hours up the coast had given her skin enough color to make the dress pop, and she had no visible tan lines. She'd been afraid she'd sprayed on the sunblock too early, but she'd struck the right balance. A spray tan would have been better, of course, but she never had time for that. She reached up to tussle her hair. That was an unavoidable casualty of driving a convertible, but there was no way she was giving it up. So she sighed and dug out her curling iron instead. 15 minutes later, she had her hair tamed, her makeup perfectly applied, and a pair of strappy nude stilettos to step into. She squared her shoulders and faced her reflection, lifting her chin to practice the relaxed, amused smile she would need to fake for the next hour and a half. She could only begin the process of separating a whole terrace full of plastic surgeons from their money if they believed that smile. It didn't look quite right, so she took a deep breath, thought about the beach in San Juan del Sur, and her smile relaxed all on its own. She was ready. These guys had no idea what was about to hit them. Brooke! Ridley's head shot up at the sound of the name in time to see her emerging from the elevator bank. The mussed hair and subtly sexy tank top and jeans had been replaced by long, loose curls, and a dress so fitted she had to have been sewn into it. Part of him was disappointed to watch her walk toward the man who had called her name and slide her arm into his, an inviting smile on her glossy coral lips. And part of him wanted to thank her for the view of her spectacular legs. Mostly he was bummed. The dude had 20 years on her, easy. She was one of them, a girlfriend, it looked like, based on her lack of a wedding ring, and he was disappointed in himself too. His radar was off. He should have recognized her type right away. He probably would have if he was in LA. At least he could flirt with her now. There was no danger of a real connection. It would be fun to see how much he could interfere with whatever she had going on with the doctor who had whisked her away. Tomorrow, maybe. If he had the energy after shooting, he'd see how much havoc he could wreak between her and her date. But for right now, he'd issue the parting shot for the night and go home to pull a travel bag together and drive back, so he could crawl into bed and get a good night's sleep before his early alarm. "Colby," he called, gesturing one of the bellboys over. "Can you take this up to room 529 and leave it for the guest?" He handed Colby the framed paper, and Colby looked down at it, confused. "Yes, this. Put it on the nightstand. Trust me, it's what the guest requested." Colby shrugged. "I've dropped off stranger things." He took off for the elevators, and Ridley allowed himself a grin before placing the plastic "Please see the front desk for help" sign on his counter and heading for the locker room. He changed and slid the uniform into an unclaimed locker in case he needed to fill in for Marco again and headed out. His thoughts drifting from women who weren't at all what they seemed to his morning photo shoot and how to capture the surf exactly as it was. Brooke uncurled her fingers from her sweating glass and flexed them a few times. She needed to relax, she reminded herself. Intensity would only be her enemy here, but when she spotted Gavin Dillard making his way toward her, she had a hard time squashing her intense dislike of him. He started with his standard opening, and she almost mouthed it with him, wondering if it would startle him to realize she could rehearse his words. "Hey, Dr. Beautiful, looking good." "How are you, Dr. Dillard?" She kept her smile relaxed, even though she hated the nickname. "Great. Be even better when I hit the links tomorrow." "Are you going early or late?" "Mid-morning. Sleep in, brunch, golf. Perfect vacation." "Sounds like a good morning, but—" Dr. Dillard groaned. "Don't even say it. I know that look in your eye. You want something from me." "Wrong," she said, now offering her mischievous smile. "I want to do something for you." "And what's that?" Dr. Dillard asked. "I want to offer you the kind of quality of life that money can't buy." He glanced around the hotel terrace, the tables overflowing with lush fruit and high-end cheeses, the flames of tiki lamps flickering in the sea breeze. He held up his whiskey glass in a mock salute. "I don't know. Money has brought me a pretty good quality of life so far." Brooke wouldn't let that deter her. "Imagine then what I can offer you if it's something you can't even put a price tag on." Vanessa Dillard joined them in time to hear that, and she frowned. "Are you trying to pull Paul away from his work again, Dr. Dresden?" Vanessa was exactly like the kind of patient that drove Brooke craziest. The ones who came in just as their faces were reaching the point that character could make them interesting, and then asking for a scalpel to take it all away. But these kinds of clients kept Brooke's practice going and ultimately funded her trips with smiles from the heart to the remote native villages to do the work that actually mattered. So Brooke smiled and schmoozed her. "It's more like I'm trying to offer him a different kind of work with a totally different reward." Vanessa flashed her a tight smile. But really, with a facelift that fresh, any smile would have been tight. Her tone left no doubt that she was annoyed, though. "Brooke, we've got 3 kids in private school, one about to graduate and attend an even more expensive college, and you know how California taxes are. We can't give up 3 weeks of paying clients for Gavin to go camping and play superhero." Brooke's smile didn't falter. She knew Vanessa didn't mean to be as demanding as she sounded. If anything, she was sure it was guilt pricking at Vanessa that caused her to be so sharp. The Dillards were privileged but had forgotten, or maybe never realized it. If only Gavin would come down to Nicaragua this winter, it would forever change him. And that's probably exactly what Vanessa feared. It would add a whole new dimension to their already hectic lives. But if Brooke could just get Vanessa to see it was the kind of dimension that would make them rich in their souls. But highly competitive LA plastic surgeons didn't talk in terms of souls. Rumor was they didn't have them. Brooke being the exception, she hoped. She had so much soul that it ached for the kids she couldn't get to. The thought put her back on track. "I know you have a tea time tomorrow, but that's when I'm presenting on new maxillofacial surgical techniques. You should come and check out for yourself the difference it makes. You'll want to make a difference too after seeing it." If he had a heart, he would anyway. Only a zombie could be immune to the smiling post-op faces she stacked in her PowerPoint. Gavin opened his mouth to answer, but Vanessa beat him to the punch. "Since you're not a parent, you may not understand this, but making sure Gavin gets in his round of golf matters. His work schedule is punishing. He needs to recalibrate and reset emotionally so he can be a fully present father to our kids when he gets back. I know what you're doing is important, but our value of trying to find the work-life balance is a good value too." Brooke's smile slipped, and Vanessa detected it, her own frown reappearing. Great. That meant Brooke's judgy face, as her sister liked to call it, had shown through her social mask. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. Gavin can't be a walking billboard for his business the way you can, she said, her voice pleasant despite the irritation in her eyes. He has to work much harder to build a client base than you do. He can't give up weeks at a time to go do charity work when he already has a family to provide for. There were so many things wrong with Vanessa's words that Brooke didn't know where to start. She decided to take them in order. With the most even tone she could manage, she waded in. I'm not a billboard for my business. Then who did your work? I hope you're giving him credit. Is it Dr. Mark Marion? Vanessa asked, tossing out the partner name that graced the glass doors of the fancy medical suite where Brooke worked. Dr. Dillard interrupted before Brooke could answer. She hasn't had any work done, he said, eyeing her. But he did it with the same analytical studies she used on her own patients. You have something against it? Vanessa asked with a lilt of her reshaped chin. I can't win with you, can I? Brooke asked, letting all of her irritation go. The Dillards were a lost cause, and she had no energy to waste on that. If I'm getting work done, I have an unfair advantage because I'm a walking brochure, and if I don't, it's because I think I'm too good for it. Is that it, Vanessa? Vanessa only lifted one tan shoulder and let it drop again. Brooke had no problem retreating so she could regroup and wage her campaign in less combative territory. I'm sorry, you guys. I definitely don't want to upset you, especially when you should be enjoying the resort and your free time. Ignore me. I'm going to get myself something to eat. Maybe that will civilize me. Vanessa gave her a cool nod, and Dr. Dillard wouldn't meet her eyes. So with a murmured goodbye, she turned toward the fruit buffet. She'd picked up a few pieces of grilled pineapple when she turned at a light touch on her elbow to find Gavin Dillard standing there. I'm sorry I can't do more right now, but with the kids and my surgery schedule... He trailed off and extended a check to her. I can always find people to write checks, Dr. Dillard. I need people who can go down there and do the work. I need your skills. He shrugged. I can't. I'm sorry. He pushed the check toward her and she took it, finally glancing at the amount. $5,000. She could put all of them to good use. But she could have put him to even better use. Still, she took the peace offering and smiled, a real one. Thank you. I'll make sure every penny counts. He nodded and headed back to his wife. Brooke scooped a few strawberries onto her plate and turned to survey the crowd, nibbling at the pineapple as she considered who she could go after next. She'd come to the conference determined to bag a surgeon, and she'd do it by hook or crook. But she really hoped the hook worked because she didn't have the faintest idea of how to be a crook. 2 hours later, she dragged back to her room. She'd scared up a few more donations to Smiles from the Heart. But the thing she needed most, skilled surgeons, eluded her. She leaned her forehead against her hotel room door for a full minute, breathing in and out until the tension in her chest eased. When she straightened and walked in, ready to map out her game plan for recruiting surgeons tomorrow, she took one look at her bed and burst out laughing. A framed picture of Tom Hiddleston's face in full Loki getup scowled at her from her pillow. She snatched it up to read the note scrawled with Sharpie in the corner. It's a pleasure to be of service to you. Let me know if there's anything else I can do. The sheer cheekiness of the concierge in sending it up collapsed her into giggles. Oh man, she must be overtired. Her cheeks began to hurt. Oh well, if I laugh my face off, I know how to fix it. And that only made her laugh harder, all the way until the tears came and she wasn't sure which ones were from hilarity and which were from frustration. Chapter 3. Friday morning, Ridley glanced at the text that had just come in and called out to Brent. Gotta go. Sorry, man. No worries, Brent said. I appreciate you doing it. But Ridley was halfway across the lobby heading toward the beachfront exit, so he waved over his shoulder, not checking to see if Brent had seen the acknowledgement. Pierce Van Wagenen was about to surf a heat, and the magazine wanted a whole photo essay on him, one showing the progression of his form through the stages of the competition. The man was lethal whether he was loose and easy like he tended to surf during the qualifying heats, or laser-focused during the elimination rounds. Either way, he dominated. No other pro had such inconsistent form while posing consistent wins. "Ridley!" Brent called when he'd almost reached the sand. His friend jogged to catch up with him. "I know you're in a rush, but talk to me about this when you get a chance, okay? I don't know what it means." He handed Ridley a sheet of paper. "It came in off of our guest request app last night, but no one's sure what's up, so let me know if you do." He flipped Ridley a fake salute and hurried back toward the front desk. Ridley glanced down at it and grinned as he hustled past the bleachers set up for the spectators. Mariposa guest request from B. Dresden, room 529. Text: "I appreciate you sending Tom up. I do enjoy some Loki. But not every lady is looking for a man to reform. Sometimes she needs a Captain Nichols. Your efforts are noted, though." His grin faded at the "but." It figured she'd be one of those high-maintenance women who needed more even when someone had gone the extra mile. Whatever. Not his problem. He reached the sand and almost had to muscle his way to a prime spot. Several of the other photographers did a double take when they saw him in the hotel's Hawaiian shirt. "Whoa, dude," said Laddie Burrows, Ridley's biggest competition for freelance work and a complete tool. "You do not look like you. I'm shooting this incognito for kicks." "You're not famous enough to need a disguise," Laddie said, confused. "You're dumb but cute, Laddie. I don't even understand our conversation. Just smile and look pretty," Ridley said, clapping him on the shoulder before turning his lens on the waves again. Laddie didn't understand because there was nothing to understand. It was a nonsensical conversation, but Ridley liked to throw him for a loop sometimes, see if it gave him an edge in the shooting. Ridley disappeared into the rhythm of the waves, watching the surfers cut across the surface, framing his shots. Pierce won his heat and made it look like he hadn't even tried, but he'd executed some epic cutbacks. The guy was a beast. Ridley stayed after Pierce was done, shooting a new kid coming up through the women's ranks, a girl out of San Clemente who had impressed him in the last 2 junior competitions. She was one to watch now that she'd hit the adult circuit. It wouldn't be too long before sponsors were knocking down her door, and he could hurry that along if he had some great shots to send in to his editor. Eventually, the waves turned mushy again, so he put his camera away and hiked back through the sand to the Mariposa. He really wanted to get out of the hotel uniform and into his own threads. He checked his watch. He might even have time to finally get his sandwich at the Sandpiper before he had to jump into his photo edits. "Thanks for Tom." The slightly husky voice snapped him out of planning his exciting to-do list. He glanced up to find Brooke smiling at him from her table for one at the sand's edge. A half-eaten salad sat in front of her, and she'd slid her sandals off and stretched her legs out in front of her. Her long, lovely, peach-turning gold legs. She was a Ralph Lauren ad in her loose white linen sundress, wholesome and gorgeous. But he'd dated enough women to know that her effortless appearance had taken a lot of time and enough money to feed a Bangladeshi family for a year. What the customer wants, the customer gets. Or almost gets, he added, remembering her close but no cigar response through the app. I got a laugh. A big one. It was almost as good as Tom himself in that moment. Glad you enjoyed it, he said, crossing so he was at the edge of her table. I make it a point to please. Care if I join you? The skin around her eyes contracted the tiniest bit, so quickly that he doubted most people would have noticed it. But there was no mistaking it, a touch of disgust. Are you allowed to do that? She asked. Am I? He almost repeated the question until he glanced down at his concierge duds and realized what she was asking, and that his uniform turned her off. She was obviously here hunting bigger prey, not a lowly lobby monkey. Snob. He smothered a grin. He was definitely going to mess with her now. He pulled out the seat opposite her and made himself comfortable. I'm off duty for the day, he said. My time is my own, for the rest of the night. She flinched at his innuendo. Time doesn't really belong to anyone, does it? It just is. Deep, he said, and watched a light blush color her cheeks at his mocking tone. He didn't apologize. She'd been a jerk first. Blame the view. She waved toward the Pacific. It makes me wax philosophical. How was work today? He smiled at her new tone. It was polite to the point of painfulness. Keep your distance underlined every word she spoke. It was perfect. I couldn't love what I do more. Her eyebrows drew together. That's good. Now she sounded concerned. You definitely went above and beyond what you needed to for me. And is that why you were on the beach with the camera? Were you taking pictures for a guest? He glanced down at his camera bag. Something like that. I can relate to taking pride in your work, but do you ever feel restless? Like you want something more? She meant professionally, and it bothered him that she would sit in judgment of his job, even though she wasn't judging his real job. But she didn't know that, so he stretched out even more in his chair, making sure his legs grazed hers before coming to a rest so close to them that he could feel her heat. She didn't move. He didn't know how to read that. Was it because she was open to flirting? Her chin rose the tiniest bit. He grinned. Her stillness was because she wasn't going to back down from a challenge. How's your stay at the Mariposa so far? Not super productive, she said, her forehead wrinkling. How productive do you need to be when you're staying in a beach resort? She lifted her glass to him in acknowledgement and took a sip. Fair point. Can I ask what you're trying to produce? I told you. That stumped him until he remembered. Miracles? Miracles. He wondered what miracle she needed. She looked stressed now that he could study her, but not a life-or-death kind of stress. Maybe it was financial stress? He'd ask Brent to check whether or not she was paying for her own room. If she was handling the bill, what did that mean? That she was hoping to pick up a wealthy connection here to make it worth her while? What kind of miracle? He asked, but the noise of chairs scraping at a nearby table cut him off halfway through. Brooke frowned, glancing at the slim watch on her wrist. I've got class. Enjoy your lunch, she said as she dug in her purse to pay her bill. Class in the middle of a gorgeous afternoon? Stay. Enjoy it. He shifted and brushed against her leg again. It was an accident this time, but it sent a fiery ripple all the way up his body. Can't. See you around. The only classes going on were the plastic surgery ones. He wanted her to be the carefree girl in the car, the one who did her own thing, not this calculating woman who stalked her prey by sitting in on their classes. That's the definition of a lame vacation. Do you know one of the teachers or something? He became a bug in her salad beneath her cold stare. I am one of the teachers. She turned around and walked off before she could even see his jaw fall open. Oh, this was bad. This was so very bad. He'd made every sexist assumption he could possibly make because he'd misinterpreted the facts in front of his face. He was a pig. He'd written off every female in the doctor's vicinity as their arm candy. He knew better. He groaned and shoved his hands through his hair. If it wasn't for the fact that most of the conference guests were coming up from LA, his mind never would have run down that track. Stupid LA. But it wasn't LA's fault. It was his stupid fault. What an idiot. What a total ridiculous waste of a progressive liberal arts education. His mother would be ashamed. His sisters would kill him. He owed Dr. Brooke Dresden the hugest conceivable apology for not seeing her, not looking past the surface, for being too lazy to recognize his own biases. He sucked. So much. And yeah, he'd made some sweeping generalizations about the male surgeons attending the conference too, but it was so much more insulting that it had never crossed his mind that she was one of them. He was also a hypocrite, he realized. It wasn't cool that she was stuck up about his job, but he judged her so much more harshly with way less evidence. It didn't get stupider than that. There was no way he could make up for it. But any woman, most especially the one who he had just completely marginalized, deserved the best apology he could make. He dropped his head to the table. Oh, he sucked. Chapter 4. Brooke wasn't a crier. It bothered her mom, who thought she was bottling her emotion in an unhealthy way. But the reality was that not being a crier was a huge asset, and had been time and time again in her career. She'd seen fellow male residents break down in tears from exhaustion and stress before she had. As her whopping audience of 3 rustled at the end of her presentation, shifting in chairs and eyeing their watches, she was glad for the no crying thing. Because if she were a crier, this is exactly the kind of thing that would have set her off. 2 of the doctors left without a word. The third, a doctor she didn't recognize, but who didn't look much older than her, nodded without meeting her eye before hurrying out. She slid her iPad into her tote and headed back toward her hotel room. She knew her presentation on advances in cleft palate repairs wasn't going to be the biggest draw at the conference. That would be Inogen Corporation's launch of its new sclerotherapy procedure, and she'd known being scheduled at the same time as that demo was going to kill attendance in her class. But she figured anyone who showed up was already going to be sold on the idea of smiles from the heart, and all she'd have to do was give them specifics and start syncing calendars for the winter trip to Nicaragua. She couldn't even convert the 3 doctors who'd wandered into her cause. Maybe her neediness had shown through, and they'd worried about getting tangled up with someone who would be a drain on their professional resources. She wanted to chase them down and shake them, hollering, "It's not my neediness, it's the kids. Did you see the slides?" Yeah, because that would put those fears to rest. Pressure in her head indicated a pending tension headache, which was the bonus she needed to make her day extra awesome. But only enlisting more surgeons would make it go away, and she'd blown her best chance. The rest of the symposium schedule flashed through her head. There was another cocktail party tonight where she could try mingling again, but it would be more of the same. By now, word had probably spread that she was looking for doctors to do international pro bono work, and she'd spend the entire cocktail party as a pariah. This was miserable. There had to be a better way. Well, screw getting all dressed up and trying to fit in. These weren't her people. She wasn't going to torture herself by sucking in her stomach in a little black dress for 2 hours and pretending to be interested in her colleagues' golf scores or spa experiences. She'd duck into 2 of the classes tomorrow that she'd promised Dr. Markmarian she would check into. Stuff like that was a cash cow for the practice, and it funded her smiles from the heart work. But she wasn't playing the schmooze game anymore. Once she cleared those classes, she was going to use the remaining 2 days to recuperate, reset, and regroup. She'd need to go back to Beverly Hills on Monday refreshed, ready to face clients and figure out how to convince them that if they could give up $6,000 for a tummy tuck, they could cough up another $1,000 for her charity. She slipped into the elevator, glad that Ridley guy wasn't at the concierge desk. He'd gone from hot to not with his chauvinism. It's not like she wasn't used to the constant surprise when people found out what she did for a living. It wasn't even the assumption itself that bothered her, because she'd gotten so used to that kind of ignorance. It was the subtle condescension she detected from the guy. He was funny and flirtatious yesterday, and then today, patronizing. That wasn't even an unusual experience for her either. Some men were idiots. But it was somehow worse coming from a guy who clearly was old enough to have set himself on a meaningful career path, but who chose instead to work a cakewalk job as an employee of a luxury hotel catering to the whims of rich people. There was nothing wrong with wealth, and nothing wrong with working for the wealthy, but... She sighed. Maybe she was guilty of her own prejudices, but she'd seen his type all over LA. Pretty guys who chose jobs that put them in the path of the socialites drifting in and out of hotels, country clubs, and restaurants looking for handsome distractions. And these guys were ready to reap all the benefits of being the boy toy of a bored millionaire's wife. Maybe it was different here, a few hours north. But even if it was, how did he, as someone who really hadn't made stellar choices in his life to end up as a concierge at the age of at least 30, get to sit in judgment of her? He had intelligent eyes. She was used to studying faces, and she could read a lot about a person in the way the lines of their faces fell. His were faint, only beginning, but they told her that he spent a lot of time thinking and even more time smiling. She hoped it wasn't his slightly sardonic smile or his blatantly flirtatious smile she'd seen. Those lines were best when they were carved out by real smiles. He'd flashed her a couple of real smiles, like when his leg had touched hers and sent heat up from her calf all the way to her stomach. Had he smiled because he'd felt that too? Whatever. She sighed and twisted her hair up with the hotel pen as she stepped out of the elevator. She was displaying her frustration over the day onto this Ridley guy, and he didn't deserve her emotional energy. She needed to be channeling all of that and figuring out how to staff the Chinandega clinic. She'd clear her head, get a good night of sleep, and attack the problem with a better attitude in the morning. She hurried to her room, anxious to shed her work clothes for something comfortable, digging into her suitcase for a pair of running shorts and a sports bra. She'd barely slipped into them when a knock followed by "housekeeping" sounded at her door, and she padded over to let whoever it was know that she didn't need maid service today. But instead of pushing a cart, a woman her age wearing a name tag that read Marie stood at the door holding an iPad. "Dr. Dresden? This was sent up for you." She swiped something on the screen and handed it to her. "You're all set." She took it, too confused to argue for a second, but when the maid turned to leave, Brooke called out for her to stop. "What am I supposed to do with the iPad when I'm done?" "You can leave it here. We'll get it back to the right place. Have a good evening." Brooke watched until she disappeared around the corner, then felt like a jerk for not tipping her. She grabbed a $5 from her purse and chased after her, calling to her again as she stepped into the elevator. "Wait, Marie, I forgot to tip you." Marie smiled. That was taken care of too. And with a whisper, the doors shut, and she disappeared with the answers Brooke was barely formulating questions for. She returned to her room and picked up the iPad, waking up the screen. It was a note. "Dear Brooke, you didn't look like you had a great day today. You looked beautiful, like you have from the second you walked through the Mariposa's doors, but you looked like you had troubles hanging around you that even the ocean breezes weren't blowing away. And then I added to them by making a completely sexist assumption. I'm sorry. I'd tell you myself, but you don't deserve even more of me and my idiocy. You need a man of refinement and culture. You need Tom Hiddleston. Please enjoy. Ridley, your concierge and Hiddleston dealer. He'd pasted a link below the note. He was overstepping. It was totally inappropriate for him to make such personal remarks, but it was hard to get too mad at someone who was beating himself up as much as she'd wanted to earlier, and even harder to get mad at a guy who was trying to buy her forgiveness with Tom Hiddleston pictures. She clicked on the link and within seconds burst out laughing. It was Tom Hiddleston, all right, but a video, not a picture, and he was reading poetry. It was glorious, as Hiddleston tended to be. His smooth voice wrapped around the lovely words of W.H. Auden and curled up in her stomach, a soothing antidote to the stress roiling it. Laughter tickled her chest at the idea of maybe not so awful Ridley scouring the internet trying to find this for her, and pushed away the last bits of bad feeling. Maybe an undemanding job wasn't the best application of his intelligence. But maybe he had good reasons for choosing the job, and she needed to let go of the judginess she'd been holding on to toward him since he was obviously repenting of his. She watched the entire clip, smiling bigger as it went on. Tom Hiddleston was perfect. Tom Hiddleston reading poetry was perfect. And Ridley the concierge was perfectly ridiculous for sending this to her. She picked up a piece of the hotel stationery and slid the pen from her hair. Dear Ridley, I watched the video. I'm worried about you. I think you've peaked. This is untoppable and I'm still here for 2 more days. We're even. You're forgiven. I probably have wrong ideas about you too. Thanks for the laugh. Brooke. She secured her hair in a ponytail and snatched a beach towel out of the bathroom, slid into flip-flops and swept up the iPad on the way down to the lobby, leaving it with the concierge on duty. Can you make sure Ridley gets this note? I'm sorry, who, ma'am? Ridley? The guy working this desk last night. And this morning? The girl furrowed her forehead. Yes, ma'am. May I get your room number in case there's any follow-up? He'll know who it's from, Brooke said, walking away with a wave. She made her way out to the beach, passing the tiki torches edging the back terrace, already lit even though the skies still showed more lavender than indigo. She turned away from the early arrivals to the conference mixer and headed for the water. She wanted to clear her mind so it would be wide open for solutions, not navigate a terrace of tan, well-dressed obstacles. The beach had emptied in the last couple of hours, and that already made her breathe easier. She spread her towel out on a stretch of sand far from the hotel and opened with a sun salutation. She'd sworn to her father never to lose her Nebraska farm roots when she'd accepted her job in California. You're going to start eating avocados on everything and doing yoga all the time, he'd complained when she told him where she was moving. She laughed and promised not to convert to Californiaism, as he'd called it, but she had to admit she loved having avocado and citrus trees growing in her condo complex's courtyard, free for the plucking, and she'd definitely come to love yoga. She moved through several more poses, opening up her breathing and letting the weight of the day fall from her body before ending in lotus. She listened to the waves, her eyes closed, her mind finally quiet. She wasn't sure how long she was there, but she could sense that the light had faded pretty completely before she even opened her eyes. And when she did, she looked out over the water with clearer vision and a renewed sense of hope that she could leave this conference with everything she needed to help Smiles from the Heart. Chapter 5. Ridley studied Brooke from a distance. He didn't want to come any closer and disturb her, even though he knew she wouldn't hear him over the waves. He wasn't sure he wanted to approach her even when she opened her eyes. People, usually women, came down to the beach to meditate or do yoga all the time during the off-peak hours. Sometimes it seemed like some of the women did it for show, wearing super skimpy outfits and holding themselves with an awareness that suggested they knew they were being watched, because that was the point. But then there were the women like Brooke, who showed up looking comfortable, and who was deep down inside of wherever her meditation was taking her, her face serene. It made him like her more, and it kept him rooted to the sand, thinking. He'd been hoping his Hiddleston apology would win her over a little, give them a chance to relax with each other and see if the electricity he felt near her was only on his side. But she already had more depth than he'd guessed, and that was a little dangerous. Then again, she was a plastic surgeon. It was hard to imagine getting too caught up in someone whose whole career depended on the vanity of others. He took a few steps closer to her. He'd liked their sparring. He could go for more of it. But he didn't know if she would, and the uncertainty intrigued him. He shook his head. He was being that guy, the one who liked a challenge. He didn't care. Brooke was clearly intelligent enough to figure that out and decide if she wanted to play. He relaxed, slinging his camera across his body and settling back on his heels to take in the newly fallen evening sky. He'd think through his shots for the morning semi-final round and wait for Brooke to finish. It was another 10 minutes before she stirred, and he straightened and walked over as soon as she unfolded her long, gorgeous legs to stretch them out in front of her. "Hey!" he called out, just loud enough to be heard over the surf. She whipped her head toward him. "Sorry, didn't mean to surprise you." She stared at him in confusion for a second, then focused. "Hi. What are you doing out here?" He dropped down beside her. "The question is, what are you doing out here? It's getting chilly. Don't you want to be up on the terrace or maybe in the dance club with the rest of your compadres?" She leaned back on her hands and shook her head, peering into the horizon instead of at him. Interesting. "This is more comfortable than in there," she said, nodding back at the hotel. "Those bars and cocktail parties are always the same. But this?" She inhaled as if she were trying to breathe in every molecule of the breeze that toyed with her hair. "This never gets old, is never the same. Watch." She closed her eyes for a few seconds and smiled out at the ocean again. "See? It's already different." "I get it." It was why he'd shot surf contests for the last 8 years without getting bored. It wasn't different from beach to beach and contest to contest. It was an entirely different ocean with each wave that rolled in. His pang of understanding twined around a touch of unease. She was definitely more his type than he'd thought. He tested her to see. "So the fancy stuff over there isn't for you, huh?" "No." She didn't elaborate, but he pushed for more anyway. "Do you not like the people or the setting?" "Yes." He laughed. "Give me something to work with here. Which do you dislike more?" She finally glanced over at him, but instead of answering him, her eyebrows rose. "You must like both if you're here even when you're out of your uniform." "I'm working." "I wouldn't think their dress code would be so laid back," she said, shooting a glance at his board shorts and TK Froghouse shirt. "Oh, I wasn't on concierge duty." She glanced at his camera. "More photography for the guests? I guess it really is an all-inclusive hotel." He laughed at her tone. Don't say that like it's a bad thing. It's why you're getting your daily dose of Hiddleston. She turned her first real grin on him, and he immediately plotted to win another one from her. The video was genius, by the way. Thank you. You're relieved of your Hiddleston duties. I couldn't stand putting the pressure on you to top that. That only made him laugh again. Sometimes the universe really, really wants you to get things right. And the universe really wanted you to have that video, so it helped me out. Do the rooms have comment cards? Because I'm going to fill one out. Ridley is the best concierge ever in the history of hotels. His skills are unmatched. Awesome. The manager will love it. She smiled at him before returning her gaze to the water. Is that it? A good concierge and beach proximity are all the Mariposa has going for it? She groaned. I sound like a brat. You sound like the opposite, which means you don't sound at all like the Mariposa usual. She glanced behind them at the hotel bathed in perfectly positioned landscape lights. It's beautiful. I think I'm uncomfortable with the... He wondered what word she was struggling to find. Furniture? Ambiance? Price? Excess. I'm uncomfortable with the excess. Right then and there, he fell a tiny bit in love with her. That was bad. And he didn't care. This isn't how you roll at home? She laughed. That's an understatement. I'm the queen of IKEA. The Mariposa is the pride of Seashell Beach. You know that, right? Before the city won the contract for it, we were a lot more like the other sleepy beach towns you passed to get here. Ramshackle, dilapidated. Charming? He tilted his head toward her. You don't think the Mariposa is charming? Impressive, maybe, but not charming. And it's really... new? Everything is so shiny and kind of antiseptic. Have you explored the grounds at all? I haven't. Been in classes all day. Teaching all of them? He teased her, getting another laugh. He was getting addicted to that sound. Now you're going too far the other way. I'm not that good. I've been checking out some new techniques. I think maybe you need a tour, he said. I'm not really into defending major developers who come into towns like ours and make them comfortable for the rich and unlivable for everyone else. But the Mariposa has been good for Seashell Beach. They work hard to contract with locals and they pay well. For as much as they charge people to stay here, they should. It's a decent wage. And a lot of the businesses around here have seen business boom. Morgan at the floral shop can barely keep up, and it's the best problem she ever had. The kitchen uses the local bakery for their breakfast pastries, which is an extra $200 a day for Delilah's shop. That makes a difference when you're an independent business. She had to hire another one of the high school kids to help her out for the summer season. Job creation, right there. And it's happening all over town. He leaned back on his hands, matching her relaxed pose. You came up from LA, right? She nodded, but he caught a small twist to her mouth and wondered what it meant. I'm a little surprised that a plastic surgeon from the cosmetic surgery capital of the world would even count the cost of staying somewhere like this. Seems like you guys, and by guys I mean women too, he said, grinning at her, would be doing well enough not to even think about the bill. I'm not most guys. I'm not even most women, she said, quirking an eyebrow at him. This is very different from where I'm from and different from where I like to spend my time. And where is that? From? Nebraska. And where do you like to spend your time? She didn't answer at first. Finally, she glanced at him. I'm more of a mountain girl. A mountain girl from Nebraska? She only smiled. So you're saying it's hard for you to relax in those surroundings? He indicated the hotel behind him with a jerk of his head. Because you don't like rich people or conspicuous wealth. Right. Like I said, I sound like a brat. No, but it makes you a contradiction. Is that a nice way of calling me a hypocrite because I'm staying here at all? She turned to study him, her face expressing curiosity rather than defensiveness. No, a hypocrite would complain about the conspicuous consumption while lounging by the pool in expensive clothes and summoning cabana boys for drinks. You're sitting on a sandy towel in your comfy clothes. You're hypocrisy-free. He straightened, brushing the sand from his hands. Here's the thing. All of this would be a little much for me as a lifestyle too, but I'm seriously offended on behalf of the Mariposa that you find it lacking in charm. Can you really tell me this isn't the best conference you've ever been to? The event manager, Reagan, put together some great stuff, I hear. She is starting to attract a lot of celebrity business. Casey Wood is even doing a big charity thing next month. I see a lot of celebrities as it is in my work. I guess you would. So I'll try something else. I noticed on one of the event lists that my friend Abby is teaching a class. She writes this cool kids book series which might not seem like it has much to do with surgery, but she always finds a way to tie stuff into the conference and people love her. A lot of conferences book here just so they can get her to present. You should drop in on her session. I saw that one, but it's geared toward managing partners in a surgery practice, so it doesn't really apply to me. Fine, none of that impresses you. You're a tough case. This is my last resort. Let me take you on the tour and show you the coolest thing at the Mariposa. She laughed and glanced down at her clothes. I promise I'm not high maintenance. I mean, look at me. It's more that I've just checked out on the day already. And that means not dressed for walking around the Mariposa. You're the guest, so you're the boss. If you decide to roll into the lobby in your footy pajamas, as far as the staff is concerned, then that's the way it should be done. What about the other guests? I have a bunch of colleagues up there who are going to think I've lost it if they see me wandering around in my workout clothes looking like I don't have a clue about protocol. He stood and extended a hand to pull her up. She accepted it. Hers was cool from the sand, but the friction of her palm sliding against his sent heat racing up his arm anyway. He froze for a split second, and when he pulled her to her feet, he was slow to let her go, meeting her eye and offering his everything will be fine smile. We'll avoid your plastic pals. And as far as what they think, do you care? She returned his smile with the slow one of her own before tucking a stray hair behind her ear. You've got 30 minutes to make your case. He leaned down to scoop up her towel. Anything to please, he said, shaking it out and folding it before tucking it under one arm and holding the other arm out to her. Charmed yet? She threw her head back and laughed. Maybe she wasn't yet, but he was falling under a spell he didn't understand. The Mariposa will get its chance, she said. Tell me where to meet you. I need to put this towel away. You really don't have this luxury thing down yet. You've got to make yourself way less thoughtful and way more entitled. Watch. A waiter walked by as they skirted the far edge of the terrace. Hey, Brady, Ridley said, squinting at the waiter's name tag. This guest is done with this towel. Can you take care of it for her? You don't have to do... Brooke started to say, but the waiter took the beach towel with a smile and a cheerful, sure thing. She narrowed her eyes at Ridley. That wasn't his job. Rule number 1 at a luxury resort. Everything is everyone's job the second a guest makes a request. I promise that's not even the most annoying thing he's even been asked to do today. She tilted her head at him. You think the guests here are annoying? Yep. Then why work here? He stalled by crooking his head toward a path branching off of the main one leading to the hotel and guiding them toward it. He should admit to not being an actual Mariposa employee, but some stubborn part of him wanted to win her over on sheer personality, not because she might find his job glamorous. He had no problem with using someone's career to figure things out about them, but she already knew he loved photography. He'd too often been a notch for women, something to check off their list. Globe-trotting photographer, check. He was probably the next best thing to pirate or explorer, as far as fitting the adventurous type category went. Brooke's expression had grown more intent as he took his time with an answer. He realized he was the one verging on hypocrisy here. He'd fully intended to draw her into fun and games during her stay, and suddenly here he was, not wanting to just be a guy she could tell her girlfriends about when she reported back after the weekend, then forget. It's kind of a side gig with decent perks, like a free room. Watch your step, he said to distract her. My grandmother used to always tell me the best things were bends, as in around the bend, because every bend in the road meant a surprise, and you never knew what you might find. A spectacular view, a dip, a hill. Anyway, prepare yourself, because around this next bend in the path is where the awesomeness happens. I'm excited. Is it a pony? She asked, cracking him up. Yes, because the Mariposa understands that not even its richest guests ever outgrow their childhood desire for a pony. The path straightened out again, but a smaller one forked off to the left, away from the hotel, and about 30 yards down it, a soft glow from more outdoor lights diffused over the top of a hedge of hibiscus bushes. What's that? Brooke asked. A gazebo? She sounded game, but not overwhelmed by his surprise. No, something way better, he said, sliding his hand down to hers to tug her toward it. It felt right. You're about to discover how the Mariposa got its name. Do you speak Spanish? Men use Spanish, mainly, but I know Mariposa means butterfly. Have you wondered why they didn't name this place the Breakers or White Sands or something beachier? Yeah, actually. Mariposa almost seems quaint. They stepped through the opening in the floral hedge, and she gasped. Ridley squeezed her hand. Not a gazebo, a wishing well. Brooke slid her hand from his and hurried over to it, making him regret bringing her somewhere that would make her let go of him. Brooke leaned over the well and yelled down, Andy, you goonie! Goonies? Nice. She kept zigging when he thought she would zag. I like that you like that, she said, glancing at him over her shoulder. So my Tom Hiddleston skills, my cutting-edge camera, my official Mariposa Aloha shirt all do nothing to impress you, but liking the Goonies is what does it for you? Yeah, she grinned. But the poetry video? It even edged out knowing the Goonies. I'm feeling so much pressure now, he said, leaning against the well with his arms folded across his chest. Yeah, you look super stressed, she said, rolling her eyes. You must have something good up your sleeve. Ridley shrugged. Depends on how you feel about nerdy wishing well trivia. She pressed her hand over her chest. Who told you? Who told you I love it? Smart Alec. He couldn't have quit grinning if he tried. Good thing he didn't feel even the least bit like trying. So yes, the Mariposa has only been around for a year, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have character. This well is older than the city of Seashell Beach. Really? She ran her finger across the mosaic-encrusted beams edging the canopy. I thought maybe this was a faked patina to give it some credibility. Nah, this thing is stone-cold legit, he said, tapping the stones forming the well itself. Boo, she said. You owe me the well trivia for making me listen to your bad jokes. Let's start with this. It's 300 years old. The landscape architect hunted it down in this tiny Mexican village and had it brought here. Oh, that doesn't seem right. She stepped back from the well and rubbed her palms on her shorts like she was trying to wipe away some guilt. Just because a corporation can buy something doesn't mean it should. You can enjoy it guilt-free, he said. The village was a ghost town, and the state government had no interest in keeping it. The Mariposa's owner made a hefty donation to the state of Yucatan's Historical Preservation Society, along with a promise to let them buy it back if they ever decided they wanted it. Unless that happens, it's here, with all of its stones and mythology intact. It is pretty perfect with this butterfly design. She stooped to trace one of the monarch butterflies in the tilework near the base of the well. She straightened again, leaning over to peer down into it, as if she could make out anything in the inky blackness of its shaft. Did you say mythology? Like the usual toss in a coin and make a wish? It fascinated him how quickly she could transition from relaxation to stress over the well's origins back to relaxation again. He cleared his throat. The owner of the Mariposa is Native American, or half anyway. His tribe has a tradition that butterflies carry wishes up to the Great Spirit who grants them, which is a cool enough story. But on top of that, the legend in this little village the well came from is that if you dropped a coin into the well, you would get your heart's desire. So you can tell it your wish, but it gives you what your heart really wants. If I promise I'm not a gold digger, will you loan me a quarter? He suppressed a wince at the gold digger reference, regretting his earlier assumptions again. He dug into his pocket and produced a quarter, presenting it to her with an obnoxious flourish. It's a gift, not a loan. Moneybags. Was that a tiny shiver he saw when her fingertips brushed his hand? She closed the coin in her fist and grinned. Thanks. Now I'm going to throw my precious in the well. What if it comes flying back up, Goonies style? Then it will officially be the coolest thing that's ever happened. Oh man, I got your hopes up. You're not going to see that coin again. Sorry. How can I make it up to you? Give me another quarter to wish with? He fished 2 more from his pocket. I'm wishing too. I'll tell you mine if you tell me yours. She plucked a quarter from his hand. I know what yours is. His eyebrows flew up. Prove it. She ignored him and closed her eyes for a moment, her expression intent before she tossed her first coin in and listened for the splash. That was a serious wish, he said. Miracles usually are. And now wish number 2. She slipped his wishing quarter from his fingers. I'll toss mine in with yours to make sure it comes true, she said, dropping them into the well. You're that sure you know what I want? She glanced around the garden enclosure and smiled. A tropical garden with the ocean in the background, a rising moon, a wishing well, a guy and a girl? I think we might have wished for the same thing. She reached out and tugged on his shirt with the barest pull, but it was enough to draw him to her. Can I get away with saying this is how magic happens? Only if I can make fun of you for it later. Done, she said, and he smiled as she slid her hand behind his head to draw him down. But he was done too, done waiting, and he dipped down and kissed her. She smiled against his mouth, and he lifted his head slightly to smile back. You have not one time in 2 days been anything I expect. That makes two of us, because I haven't done a single thing in the last hour that I've expected. So we're even, yeah? And I'm going to keep the streak alive. She leaned into him for another kiss, her fingers now drifting up from his neck to brush through his hair, tickling him. But that's not what sent a shiver racing down his back. Cold? She asked, leaning back. Opposite, he said, kissing her again, deepening the kiss until a small moan escaped her. Hot, she agreed, dropping her head against his chest. He held her there, amazed that it was enough for him to simply feel her there. No thought about what came next or how the night might end. She withdrew her arms from his neck, and he mumbled a protest, but she only moved them to his waist, sliding them around him and resting her cheek against his chest. The wind kicked up a strand of her hair, and he brushed it back behind her ear. Are you checking me out, doctor? Listening to my heartbeat? I'm just being. I don't do that a lot when I'm here. At the hotel? I mean LA, I guess. You're 3 hours away from LA. You can leave it behind you. I'll let you just be. She nestled into his chest even further. He smiled out at the ocean, moonlight painting the calm water with tiny brushstrokes of silver. Brooke? Sorry, I lied. I can't let you just be, he said, tilting her chin up and kissing her. She sighed against his lips and returned the kiss, long and slow. He sat on the edge of the wishing well and drew her to stand between his legs. She rested her hands against his chest and smiled at him, their faces level now. I believe in the wishing well, she whispered. He stole another kiss. Repeat after me. The Mariposa has charm. She reached up to ruffle his hair. It has charm, all right. But instead of dropping her hand, she kept brushing her fingers through his hair. Soft. He turned his head to trace her palm with his lips. Soft, he agreed. She met his eyes, still smiling, but after a couple of seconds her smile wavered, and she blinked. He knew before she even stepped back that the spell was broken. You're thinking again. She shrugged. About what? Tomorrow, and about the day after that. I go home Monday. Back to reality. Reality? I thought you said you live in LA. Nice one, she said with a fleeting grin. Her body hinted at a turn toward the garden exit. That's it? He asked. You're going to toy with the handsome concierge by the wishing well and walk away without looking back? A sound of regret puffed out of her on a tiny sigh. Let's agree that no one got played here and that, yes, it's time for me to go back. He caught her hand and drew her in again. Tomorrow is the last day of the conference, right? But you don't leave until Monday. So what are you planning to do all day Sunday? I don't know. I'm staying because I promised my mother I would take a day to spoil myself. I don't really know how to do that, so I'm open to suggestions. Oh, we're getting into my specialty now, Dr. Brooke. Will you give me your number and let me be in charge of your Sunday? I promise not to even make myself part of it if you don't want to. But every time I've seen you, until I found you meditating, you've done a version of this. He furrowed his brow and frowned slightly. No one should look that stressed unless the world is caving in on them. Is it caving in on you? She shook her head and dropped her gaze to their hands. He still held hers, feathering light strokes against her palm. I'm glad, he said. Listen to your mother. Take one day to appreciate all of this. He swept his free hand toward the hotel. And if you still can't get behind the idea of the luxury, at least spend the day appreciating that. This time, his hand encompassed the ocean. She nodded, and he liked the measured movements of her head, like each tilt and drop of her chin was a promise, one she was making seriously. "All right, I'll listen to my mother. Give me your phone." He unlocked it and slipped it into her hand, waiting for her to program her number in. "Ridley?" "Yeah?" "I want you to be part of my Sunday." "You know how to say all the right things." She laughed and took a step back, tugging on his hand to pull him to his feet. "Race you to the hotel? Scared?" "Not even a little," he said and took off running. "Cheater!" she called, but he could hear her behind him already, and he wondered if his sandals versus her bare feet would mean she could catch him. She was gaining on him, and as she pulled even with him, she stuck out a foot and tripped him, sending him sprawling onto the manicured lawn. She stopped beyond his reach. "Surgeons are cutthroat. Didn't you know that? We'll do anything to even the score." He pushed himself up and grinned. "I deserved it. Are you all right?" He held out his arms and did a quick turn. "No injuries, Doc." She cocked her head and narrowed her eyes. "You totally deserved that. But just so we're clear, I would have beat you without cheating. I went to college on a track scholarship." That's sexy." She sketched a mocking curtsy, gave him a small wave, and ambled back toward the hotel, all relaxed lines and soft edges. He watched her progress up the steps and shook his head, still smiling. What had he gotten himself into? Chapter 6. Brooke fell onto her bed far too wired to even think about sleep. It was the kind of wired where everything in her body was electric, from the feel of her own eyelashes against her eyelids each time she blinked, to the way the thoughts zipped through her head, bright and neon and perfect. Not thoughts, feelings, a carnival of them. When had she last felt that? She hadn't played that way since last summer, when she'd gone home to Nebraska for the 4th of July weekend and spent it on Lake McConaughey with her high school friends, laughing like she'd never left. It was an effervescence that only happened with summer, but somehow Ridley had made that happen again. Ridley was summer personified. Messy dark blonde hair, warm skin, lazy smiles. She climbed off the bed and headed for the mirror, fingers still on her mouth, wondering how long before the feeling of his lips would fade, and if the giddiness would fade with it. She grimaced, then laughed at the reflected Brooke laughing back at her. A tousled hair mess of a woman who had most definitely been kissed. Maybe she should hire Ridley to hang around her office and kiss all the women who came in wanting fillers. She was sporting the look they all paid her to give them. Except she'd rather keep Ridley's kisses to herself, which was stupid and a pointless way to feel. A few mornings from now, she'd be driving away from the hotel and not looking back. Wait, wasn't that the perfect reason to kiss him? To spend a few sun-soaked days being carefree? Getting her head right, as her mom would put it. It was the whole filling her bucket thing, replenishing her emotional energy so she had more to give the little ones who needed her in Nicaragua. Being down there, doing the surgeries, always rejuvenated her in a way no amount of meditation and yoga could. It was the lead up to that, the scrounging money and supplies, recruiting doctors, organizing details, that wore her down. She'd need more emotional fuel than what she had in her reserves right now. Dr. Mark Marion wasn't expecting her back in the office until Wednesday. She'd planned to spend Tuesday after she got back from Seashell Beach working from home on Smiles from the Heart stuff, which meant she had a space in her schedule. So yeah, spending all of Monday here, soaking up a couple more days of Seashell Beach and Ridley, instead of driving home, were exactly what the doctor would order for herself. "Dr. Dresden? Dr. Dresden! Brooke!" It was hearing her first name that finally broke through her mental fog. "Dr. Benson?" she asked. hoping she'd come up with the right name for the guy hurrying across the hotel lobby to reach her. He'd been in her class the day before and refused to make eye contact with her directly, but she'd caught him staring at her out of the corner of her eye several times. What did he want? Was he going to try to make a move now? Boo. Yeah, Leland Benson, he said, reaching her. I took your surgery technique class. I saw you there. What can I do for you? He scrubbed his hand through his hair, and it didn't move. Super gel. Nice. Up close, she could see the glint of a wedding ring on his hand and guessed his age to be mid-40s, but with a little work around the eyes and probably a jaw reshaping. I've been thinking about what you said. I have a practice down in Orange County. It's a nice place, nice people. But my wife and I have been talking about how we miss the diversity from my surgical residency in New York. The other day, my youngest, who's 11, said, "Never mind." He slid his hands into his pockets. Suffice it to say, we've recently come to the conclusion that our kids need more exposure to real life than what they're getting in our gated community. Brooke gave him a nod that was an invitation and a plea. Tell me more. Please let it be the words I want to hear. I was trying to figure out how to help with your Nicaraguan project, but I kept getting hung up on the whole idea that there's no way to include my family, and we really want to create some family experiences around humanitourism. Have you heard that expression? Where you go on vacations and do good for others? My kids' friends do these mission trips, I guess they call them, but we're not really religious. I get what you're saying, Brooke said, beginning to smile. Yes, well, he cleared his throat. I called my wife and told her about it and how I wished that there was something we could all do, but where I could still use my surgical skills. She looked into Chinandega Village and she called me back this morning. A smile, half rueful, half proud, spread across his face. Tracy is a force of nature. She's spent the last day and a half doing research, and she's figured out how she and our kids can go work at a nearby orphanage for the week while I work at the clinic. She's excited. Which will probably be overwhelming to the orphanage, but I'm excited now too. And our kids will be, once they get down there. But I'm wondering if you still have room for another surgeon. Brooke's mouth fell open. So that's a yes? Leland Benson asked, grinning. She grabbed him and hugged him. Give that to your wife for me. Yes, we need you. And her. And all other Bensons. Brooke? She whirled to find Ridley standing a few feet away, once again not in uniform. Hey! She turned and hugged her newest recruit. I'll find you later and get your information. This is going to be awesome. Dr. Benson strolled away, still grinning. She walked toward Ridley, not caring that her smile was huge and he might think it was for him. Maybe it was. It was for sexy Ridley coming to meet her with his wind-tousled hair, for Dr. Benson and his force of nature wife, for the Mariposa, the conference, the world. Do you have plans already? Ridley asked, his voice even. Too even. Like he was working awfully hard to keep it so nonchalant. Not really. It looked like you and... He jerked his head after the retreating Dr. Benson. Brooke's insides felt like they were smiling too, stretching and expanding in happy ways. That was my miracle, not a date. The well worked. The Mariposa is 100% charming. She slid an arm through his and peered up at him. How cute that you're already jealous. Or maybe I should be disturbed. Should I be disturbed? Ridley pulled her against his side and laughed. You should probably be thrown over my shoulder and carried to the pool so I can drop you in for that. You wouldn't dare. If I was 16, sure. But as a grown man, I'll just use my words. I like you. I have no claim on you. And I'm not jealous. but I will definitely do a better job of entertaining you than Dr. Dork." She burst out laughing. "He's happily married. Not that it's your business." "It isn't," he admitted. "But I like hearing it anyway. So, what's the miracle?" She turned so she could slide her arms around his waist. "The miracle is that I finally got a commitment I really needed for work, and that means that for the first time in months, I don't have to think about that project for a little while." It always felt like she was bragging about herself as the super humanitarian to say more than that in casual conversation, so she changed the subject. "What are you doing here? Are you coming to take over my Saturday too?" "Maybe. Are you busy?" "Possibly not, but first I'm going to need another comment card. Plus side, concierge has excellent interpersonal skills. Negative side, he forgets stuff." "What stuff?" "My day has been annoyingly Hiddleston-free so far." He winced. "I had one job and I messed it up." "Yeah, if you don't want me to report you to corporate, you're going to have to make it up to me." "Absolutely. Whatever you want. What can I do for you? Send a towel warming rack to your room? Fetch all your shoes for a complimentary polish? Come and read you the newspaper every morning?" Brooke jerked her head back. "Please say you made that last one up because you have an overactive imagination." "No, ma'am," Ridley said, leading her toward the back terrace. "I once had a guest with macular degeneration who came and stayed for a month. And he liked to get the news from the papers because he said TV news wasn't trustworthy. So I sat and read him the news section every morning." Brooke had a niggling suspicion that the guest hadn't asked for Ridley to do that so much as Ridley had volunteered. "You're an interesting guy," she said. She wondered how long he'd been at this side gig and how long he planned to stay at it. But really, when it came down to it, she catered to a wealthy clientele as the means to an end. Maybe that's what Ridley was doing too, using his upscale hotel job to fund a different dream, like photography. "You still haven't convinced me not to report you to corporate." She let a teasing smile play on her lips, and he flicked them an appreciative glance. "Name your price." She shook her head. "Not how this works. You failed in your Hiddleston obligations. You have to surpass my expectations, and I don't know what I expect. Good luck figuring it out." He slid his hand down to tangle their fingers together and lead her toward the restaurant entrance instead of the terrace. "I'm going to need fuel for that, so we're going to eat the best ceviche you've ever had, and I'll have it solved by the time we're done." The hostess smiled as they approached. "Outside for two?" "Definitely," Ridley said. They followed her to a table at the furthest edge of the restaurant's patio, giving them the closest view of the ocean, which was at high tide. "Ceviche," Ridley said to the waiter, who nodded and left. Ridley pulled out his phone. "I promise I'm not being rude," he said, tapping and scrolling. "This looks like I'm ignoring you, but in reality, this is me being all about you." "I'll take your word for it," Brooke said. And she did. Despite his eyes being on the screen, a heightened awareness prickled between them. She could still pick up the scent of his laundry detergent over the ocean breeze, and when she crossed her legs and sent the fabric of her dress floating against his leg for a whisper of a second, a muscle twitched in his cheek. "How adventurous are you?" he asked, still not glancing up. "Ceviche isn't adventurous for me." "No kidding. Raw seafood stew is no big deal for a landlocked Nebraska native?" "Nope." "Good. But I'm not talking food. How about life?" She thought of the simple buildings she'd slept in skirting the wild Nicaraguan forests, and the rough-and-tumble jeep rides up mountainsides not meant for wheels that had miraculously delivered her to remote villages to follow up with patients. "Very adventurous. Then I know how to make up the Hiddleston thing to you. Do I get a hint? She asked. A delicious restlessness shivered down her spine at the promise of mischief in his eyes. Sure. After we're done here, can you be dressed in shoes that are okay for slippery rocks? Is it weird that proposing slippery rocks is even sexier to me than someone suggesting I slip into something more comfortable? Ridley laughed. That goes on to my list of reasons you might be awesome. She leaned forward, her expression serious, and laid a hand on his arm. Not might. Am. He leaned forward too, and stole a kiss that made her head swim. No argument. The ceviche arrived. It was fresh, with notes of ají peppers, and she savored it as Ridley asked her more about her previous day in classes, and she gave him a snarky version of the ins and outs of nose jobs. I have to admit that you're not at all how I thought a plastic surgeon would be, he said. Female? And even though she'd only been teasing him, she regretted the question when he looked embarrassed. I'm really sorry about that. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have teased you. I know you meant your apology. I meant that I expected a plastic surgeon would be more plastic. Not physically or whatever, more fake inside. Or maybe totally real and upfront, but with zero depth. She nodded. A lot of them are. Some of us enter this field purely for the money. Some of us do it because the hours are much better than a regular surgeon's. And some of us do it because the stakes don't seem as high. Which one is your reason? She shook her head. None of them. Then what is? She almost told him. About her little sister born with a cleft palate and how surgery made it possible for Haley to live a completely normal life without any hint of a birth defect. She almost told him about how a 5th grade social studies report had led her to stumble across the harsh reality that in other places, a cleft palate meant a life on the margins. She would have told him, if it mattered for him to know, that she had found her life's passion at the age of 11. But it didn't, so she kept her answer simple. There's an opportunity for real good in plastic surgery, but to do it, I have to fund it. A look of understanding crossed his face. And to fund it, you need a lucrative practice in LA. It makes it easier, she said. So the miracle you were looking for, it's related to the good you think plastics can do? Yeah. She changed the subject. This was the perfect thing to eat right this second. She loved her work, and it fired her up, but it wasn't exactly light conversation. With Dr. Benson's commitment, she could afford not to think of it for a while. She could be present, here, now, and now was all about Ridley, and soft hair dancing in the sea wind, and his crooked, looking-for-trouble smiles. Weren't you about to promise me an adventure? Slippery rocks, etc.? Definitely some etc., he said, leaning forward for another kiss. She loved that he did that. It was a casual intimacy that she never found until deep into a relationship. But it felt right, like he wasn't thinking too hard, just feeling and doing. Meet me by the sand in 30 minutes? I'm lower maintenance than I look. See you in 15. Just have them build this to my room, okay? He smiled. I've got it. Right, he had connections around here. Great. Thanks. It was delicious. See you by the sand. 15 minutes later, he smiled at her again as she walked up wearing her yoga clothes from the night before. Only she'd laced up her favorite sneakers, too. I'm ready. We're going about a mile. Do you want to do it the easy way or the beach way? Is that a real question? She asked with a laugh as she walked past him toward the water. We're heading north, he said, catching up to her. Do you know this area? Not really, she said. Want me to tell you a little about it? She appreciated that he asked instead of diving in like a show-off. I'd like that. Besides your usual cranks, the only people who really hate the Mariposa coming in are the surfers. He waved behind them to where the temporary bleachers were receding into the distance. This beach has always been famous among California surfers, but the town never had the infrastructure to capitalize on it. So surfers have been coming here since the 50s, but with the hotel here now, the city has attracted a couple of major surf competitions because there's room to host everyone. The secret is out, and everyone's coming to Seashell Beach to try the ride. Great for the businesses, but it ticks off the local surfers. Doesn't seem to bother you. You don't surf? I do. But it's good for business, so I don't mind. I don't know how to say this without sounding incredibly condescending, but it surprises me how invested you are in the Mariposa doing well. You talk about it like you helped build it, not like you're a payroll employee. The concierge thing. Right. He slid his hands into his pockets. I wasn't really talking about that. I'm just filling in this weekend. I do other work. It didn't feel right to ask what that other work was if he wasn't volunteering the information, but she wished he would. She wanted to fill in the missing details so she could understand him better. Was he a teacher and this was his summer job? She hoped not. That would make him too sexy. Or maybe he was a struggling novelist trying to make ends meet with a job on the side. Stop. For right now, this handsome man, late summer sun, and ocean waves were all she needed. The rest didn't matter. He reached for her hand and told her more about Seashell Beach as they walked, how it had changed since he was a kid, what he loved and what he missed. The tide receded as they walked, and soon they had unbroken expanses of wave-packed sand to walk on. Are we going there? She asked, pointing to an outcropping of rocks in the distance. And if we're not, can we? That's exactly where we're going, he said. That's why I checked my phone earlier. If you get to them right after the tide goes out, the tide pools are amazing. We're going to catch them just right, but they'll be full and it's going to get pretty wet. Brooke knew she had a little kid grin on her face, but she couldn't help it. I love tide pools. Can you run in those? She asked, glancing down at his sports sandals. He rolled his eyes and dropped to the ground in a mock runner's crunch. Ready, set, go! And he took off toward the rocks. Brooke had no problem keeping pace with him, but she could tell he wasn't trying to take it easy on her, and it was another mark in his favor. It's a half mile, he called over the crash of a wave. She grinned. A sprint! What do I get if I win? Same thing I do. Etc.? Etc. He poured on some speed and she laughed out loud, matching his pace and liking that she had to work for it. She pulled away in the last 25 yards, and when he joined her a few seconds later, they exchanged smiles, but not words as they caught their breath. Him bent over with his hands on his knees, her walking in a small, slow circle while she waited for her lungs to cooperate. Finally, he straightened and caught her as her cool-down loop brought her into his orbit, pulling her to him and kissing her, sliding his hand around her neck so his fingers threaded through her hair and his thumb rested against her pulse. His kiss sped it right back up, and he smiled against her lips as he felt it accelerate. Etc., he said, brushing his lips against hers. Etc. Now he trailed a kiss along her jawline. Etc. The last kiss replaced his thumb against her pulse. She took a step back from him, suddenly aware that the sand and sea and a beautiful sky had all shrunk to become just him, only him, during those kisses. She hadn't felt this lightheaded around a boy since Channing Singer in 11th grade. It confused her. She knew many of the doctors were open to one-night stands when they traveled to these conferences, but her Midwestern values ran a little too deep for that. What else was this supposed to be? She'd agreed to let Ridley take over her Sunday because only a crazy woman turned down exploring a new town with a guy as charming as he was. And yet barely an hour with him had her heart pounding and her head spinning. And she didn't care. She didn't care. She should be running straight back to her hotel room. There was no way she was walking away from him, at least not toward the hotel. She turned and shielded her eyes to study the rock jetty. This is taller than I thought it would be. The top was 6 feet over her head. Yeah, it takes a little work to get up there, but it's pretty awesome. We might even see starfish. She wrinkled her nose. You don't like starfish? I do, but we don't have to, touch them? I kind of have a thing about that. Wait a second. Haven't you had to peel people's faces off and stuff like that in your job? She cleared her throat. Yes, this is different. I will protect you from the starfish, Brooke. His voice was serious. She planted her hands on her hips and glared at him. I'm not scared of them, I just think they're going to feel funky. Okay, so we'll only look. Feel better? No, I feel like an idiot. Aww. He pulled her into a hug, her head tucked beneath his chin. Sorry I teased you. She tickled him to get away. No, you're not. Let's go find starfish. I'm not a pansy. Follow me. He led her to a section further from the shore with several natural handholds, and she followed him up. When he reached down and pulled her to stand on top, she gasped. I love this. Shallow pools dappled the whole top of the jetty. The nearest one was only a foot away, and the feathery tentacles of the anemones inside waved at them. She knelt and peered into the water. Careful of the starfish, Ridley whispered next to her. She poked him in the side without even looking, gasping instead when a shore crab the size of $50 scuttled out the other side of the pool. I want it. Too little to eat. No, for a pet. It can come live with me. Good idea. You can keep it on a leash and buy it one of those carriers that looks like a purse. Then take it out for walks on Rodeo Drive between patients, and you'll start a whole new trend. First it was purse dogs, then babies as accessories, and now Brooke will give us crabs. His eyes widened when he heard how it sounded. Wait, that is the dumbest thing I've ever said out loud. But Brooke was laughing too hard to tell him not to worry about it. He groaned. I promise to forget you're scared of starfish if you'll forget I said that. Instead of an answer, she braced herself on one hand so she could stretch the other one out to the opposite bank of the tide pool, resting it in the crab's path. A moment later, it scuttled up onto her palm, and she straightened and held the crab out to Ridley, who stretched out his own palm for the crab to explore. Shelley and I forgive you, she said. Shelley? Seriously? Is there a better name for a crab? I guess that depends on how you feel about calling a dog Spots or a cat Fluffy. Those sound like pets named by people with a real instinct for calling it like it is. You know it's totally crazy that you'll pick up a pinching crab like it's nothing but you're afraid of starfish. Is this where I get to remind you that you implied I have a sexually transmitted disease? He cleared his throat. I meant to say that anyone who thinks your starfish phobia is funny should see you handle these crustaceans like a boss. Thought that's what you meant. They spent 2 more hours exploring the pools, joking, and playing. He was quick. Very quick. She loved how fast his mind worked, jumping from hilarious one-liners to a thoughtful discussion about ocean ecology to the best seafood each of them had ever eaten. When they finally climbed down from the rocks and walked back to the hotel, she slipped her hand into his without even thinking about it. She couldn't wait to see what he'd planned for them the next day. He walked her toward the elevators but veered right instead of stopping in front of them, drawing her through a door labeled "Employees Only, please." "How do you feel about slumming with the help?" he asked, stepping toward her and forcing her to back up against the wall. He braced his hands behind her on either side of her shoulders, making it hard for her to escape. Except she didn't want to. "I feel awesome about that." She tilted her head up at him and he leaned down and kissed her, a slower, hungrier kiss than he'd given her yet. A whole lifetime ticked past before he drew back to touch his forehead to hers. "I wish I had more time right now. I'd take you out for a real dinner and show you more Seashell Beach secrets." She wished that too, so hard. "Why can't we do that?" He pushed himself away from the wall with a sigh. "I have to work. I'm not sure how long. But part of you enjoying this whole experience is having time for yourself. So being in charge of your day means that I'm assigning you to have some alone time. The only condition is that you can't do anything related to your conference. I think you should take a nap. In fact, I strongly, strongly urge it." She smiled like she wasn't disappointed. "You're only supposed to be in charge of my day tomorrow. You don't get any more say over today." "What about tonight? Can I have any say over that?" Her eyes widened and he grinned at her, dropping a kiss on her forehead. "Get your mind out of the gutter." She delivered a mock-angry slap on his arm, then got distracted by how much she liked the lean feel of it. He tensed beneath her hand, and she glanced up at him through her eyelashes. A muscle twitched in his jaw, and his expression suggested she was about to end up against the wall again. "So you're saying I'll see you later?" He pulled her to him for a hard kiss. "Yeah, you're killing me. We need to get out of here before I forget what I'm supposed to be doing right now." He pulled her back through the service door and walked her to the elevator bank. It dinged right away and sent a sad pang through her stomach. "See you, Doc." "Later, Ridley," she said as the door closed behind them. In her room, she closed the door behind her and leaned against it. She should open her computer and review her notes. She should pull up her spreadsheets and figure out where she wanted Dr. Benson on the surgery schedule for the fall. But she wanted to lean here and pretend Ridley was still hovering over her, ready to claim more kisses. It had been a good thing she'd had him for support after the last one because her knees wouldn't have survived it on their own. She straightened and walked to the desk, cracking open her laptop and opening her Smiles from the Heart file to start a new document for Dr. Benson. She had to shove Ridley to the outer corners of her brain a few times, but she'd managed to synthesize most of the overview information Benson would need by the time someone knocked on her door. "Ridley." She hurried to open it and frowned when a smiling room service runner stood there with a covered dish. "For you," the runner said, lifting the fancy silver dome to reveal a Loki picture. Brooke laughed and took the picture, waving off the grinning runner with a thank you when he refused a tip. Ridley had scrawled a note in the corner. "I don't get it. Why would all the ladies want me like this when they could have me like this?" An arrow pointed for her to turn the paper over, and she gasped and then flat-out giggled when a smoldering Tom Hiddleston in a Louis Vuitton ad confronted her. The note on this side read, "Sorry I can't come round, love. Ridley told me no. Ring me up if you're ever in London." She needed to pay Ridley back, but she didn't know how. What would be his dream type? A blonde surf girl? A model? A wholesome Nebraska girl with gifted surgeon's hands? She wanted to zip down to the lobby and peek at him working, like she was 12 and spying on her 6th grade crush. Instead, she'd work on the preliminary surgery schedule for Nicaragua, based on the most recent report from the clinic director there. Another hour passed, and an alert from her cell phone startled her out of a case file. She picked up the phone and smiled when she saw it was a text from Ridley. "If I knock on your door, am I going to freak you out?" "Depends. Are you going to do something weird, criminal, or otherwise offensive when I open it?" "Define offensive." "Kidding." "No, I'm going to surprise you." A knock sounded and she texted back before she answered. "I'm already surprised, and I like it." She opened the door and found him leaning against the doorway, smiling at her, a large tote bag with the Mariposa logo emblazoned on the side resting at his feet. "I'm about to see if you have bona fide adventure credentials," he said. "Bring it." He grinned. "This actually requires me to bring you somewhere, but not too far. We won't even leave the hotel. You down?" "I'm down. What do I need?" "A sweatshirt and flip-flops." "Hang on." A minute later, she had her Nebraska sweatshirt on and was sliding her feet into her favorite $2 flip-flops. "Ready." He held out a hand for her, led her to the elevator, and pressed the button for the top floor. "Let me guess. We're going to sneak into the penthouse and pretend to live like kings for a few hours." "No, that wouldn't require a sweatshirt, would it? I mean, if it does, I think I have the wrong idea about how rich people in penthouses live." When they exited the elevator, he led her down the hall, winding around 2 turns until they reached the end of the hall and a door marked stairs with a discreet sign next to the jamb. He let go of her hand to pull a key from his pocket, and her eyebrows shot up. At the top of the stairs, he unlocked another door spray-painted with a stern red "No Admittance" in block letters. "Things are getting real," she said, teasing him. He paused to smile back at her. "Yeah." Something about the way he said it made her pulse go thready. He held the door open for her, and she stepped past him to discover that they were on the roof. "Wow," she breathed, taking in the view. The pool was a bright aquamarine below them, strung like a jewel inside the gentle curve of the hotel stretched around it. The ocean rippled beyond it, inky except where it captured moonlight and tossed it back up. On the roof itself, 2 of the pool's lounge chairs waited for them, complete with cushions and beach blankets. A cabana table sat beside one, and he'd placed a rose in a vase and a couple of candles next to it. "So pretty," she said. "It makes me want to climb onto one of the chairs, burrow under a blanket, and let my mind drift out with the waves." His expression relaxed, and it was only then that she realized he'd been holding on to a little anxiety about how she would take it. She squeezed his hand. "I love it." "Good. I kind of had to cobble it together with stuff I boosted out of the restaurants from servers who like me. Full disclosure, I think the candles are going to have to be for show. I'm pretty sure the wind is going to work against me." It was windier on top of the hotel than down by the waves, but Brooke loved the feel of it riffling through her hair. "I give you full credit for the thoughts, and I love everything you've already done, but is there a chance you smuggled food up here too?" She gave him her little sister's best "buy me a puppy, daddy" expression, and he laughed. "Follow me, madam." He set the bag down on the cabana table, and Brooke curled up on a deck chair and burrowed into the blanket as he pulled item after item from the bag. "It's the Mary Poppins bag," she said as he set out a binocular case, a small picnic hamper, a bottle of wine, and 2 goblets. He tinkered with his phone, and music filtered from a portable speaker. "Music is the trickiest part," he confessed. "Too smooth, and it looks like I'm trying to put the moves on you. Too random, and it looks like I put no thought into it at all." She crossed her fingers and closed her eyes, muttering, "Put the moves on, put the moves on, put the moves on." "Oh, I will," he said. and the wicked grin he flashed her made her stomach flip. But I wanted to look effortless. Got it. I'm going to pretend I don't notice. She listened to the music for a minute and smiled. Avett Brothers. Good choice. I was worrying I oversold this all when I called it an adventure. Anytime a guy I barely know knocks on my hotel room door and invites me through restricted entrances and hidden stairwells, that's definitely an adventure. A guy you barely know, he repeated. It's true, but it's strange that it's true. Does that make any sense? Complete sense. It was the ease between them. She would have given some thought to why it was so easy, but it would have made things complicated again. So she didn't think about it. She nodded at the wine bottle, her eyebrows rising to ask a question, and he smiled and uncorked it, pouring it into the goblets. She held her glass up to him and smiled. To summer nights. To summer nights. For a couple of minutes, the only sound was the mellow music and the distant crash of the waves. I'm glad you wandered through the lobby on Thursday. Ridley's voice wove through the spell that had fallen over them rather than breaking it. The truth is, I saw you before you got to the hotel. I was behind you on PCH when you were driving in. I thought you looked like the classic California girl, sun-soaked and having fun. You have mad car dancing skills. She gasped and shot up. That was you behind me? You're the hot guy in the Jeep. I'm the guy in the Jeep, anyway. He looked pleased that she'd noticed him, too. It was funny when you walked through the lobby the second time that night looking like a totally different person. The fact that you were with the conference crowd led me to think that you were as shallow as the patients I work on? He shrugged. I can tell you're not. She was quiet for a long moment. I know a Beverly Hills cosmetic surgery practice is an easy target, and some of my patients probably deserve to be made fun of. They really are shallow, but I've been surprised. For every injection I do because someone wants Kardashian, there are 2 more patients with much more complicated stories. Breast augmentations for women whose lives have been ravaged by breast cancer, or cleft palate repairs, or work on burn victims. But even with the purely cosmetic stuff, I don't know. I'm learning there are stories underneath. Maybe you see stories because you're a cool person and you assume the best about people. Like, maybe lip injections aren't about better duck face selfies, but maybe that's all there is to it. She turned to study him. I didn't take you for a cynic. Is it because you have to work with rich people too much? Maybe. He took a long swallow of his wine. Probably. I think I've been itchy for something more, something better. Like in your job? In your life? Yeah. Well, that's specific. He only smiled. Yeah. She left him to his thoughts, staring out at the ocean and feeling a peace that, despite its frustrations, her career let her make a difference in the world. A breeze blew her hair into her face, and the strands tickled as she pushed them behind her ear. She shivered, and Ridley immediately scooted onto her chair and lifted up the blankets so he could squeeze in with her, sliding an arm around her and pulling her close to his side. She leaned against him and sighed, content. Distracting thoughts bubbled up. How often did he do this? Was this a routine when he met a pretty hotel guest he liked? Did this feel as natural to him as it did to her? And she pushed them away. She didn't care. She didn't want to analyze everything about the space and time and mood they were sharing. She drifted away, almost, when Ridley spoke again. Is this okay? He asked. I like just sitting here being quiet with you, but I can bust out my sparkling conversation skills. This is pretty perfect. She turned her head to meet his eyes and smile. He took it as an invitation to dip down and kiss her, and she discovered that despite the easy way they were already draped together, she could, in fact, melt into him further. Chapter 7. This woman was killing him in the best possible way. He growled as she deepened the kiss before drawing back to drop her head against the lounge chair. He took it as an invitation to press kisses along the curve of her neck. When she spoke, he could hear the smile in her voice as he worked his way toward the hollow where her collarbones met. "That wasn't a hint," she said, laughter lacing her voice. He didn't look up, brushing a kiss against the hollow. What was this bit called? Dr. Brooke would know. But he wouldn't ask her because he didn't want to interrupt the kisses to form words. She sighed and ran her fingers through his hair, tugging his head up. "You want me to stop?" "Definitely not," she said, pulling him up so their mouths met again for more kisses. When they finally came up for air, she turned herself so she was tucked against him, her head beneath his chin, burrowing into his chest. It was the kind of thing a girlfriend did. He glanced out over the water, feeling the soft rise and fall of Brooke's breathing. He'd told himself she would be a good distraction until she cruised back to LA. He'd told himself he would play the part of the handsome hotel employee and be a little bit of wish fulfillment for her for a few days until she went home. It was one of the biggest perks of living in a beach town. He could be an item on someone's vacation bucket list whenever he wanted. He'd told himself this is what he wanted. But Brooke had flipped the script, and now he realized that everything he'd told himself about her was a lie. She wasn't a distraction or a fling. The glimpse he'd gotten past the surface of who she was wasn't enough. Was it possible to fall for someone in a couple of days? He'd never done it before, but it felt like that's what he was doing now. What was he supposed to do with that? With her? About her? Bring her to his room and end this weekend like it was a cliched vacation hookup? No. Tomorrow he would take her hiking in the Channel Islands and tell her about the rest of him, not the vacation fantasy he had presented himself as by feeding her misunderstandings about his job. He hoped she'd be cool with it, because he wanted to see her well past her checkout date. He stroked her hair and quit thinking, listening instead to her breaths grow deep and rhythmic. Her head rested more heavily against his chest as the waves lulled her to sleep. At some point, he drifted off too, waking only when she gave his shoulder a soft shake and he opened his eyes to see her smiling up at him, sleep creases from lying on his chest the whole night lining her face. She was adorable. "Good morning," she said, her voice scratchy. "I'm sorry I fell asleep on you, and please, I'm begging you, don't tell me if I drooled." "I'm not sorry," he said, sitting up and groaning at the way the damp sea air had crept into his joints. "And you didn't drool. Smart boy. Truthful boy." Well, almost. He'd be all the way truthful in a couple of hours. "We're doing a real adventure today. Hiking, exploring, dependent on a ferry to return us to civilization. What do you say?" "Yes. And also, I decided to check out on Tuesday instead of tomorrow." "Oh yeah?" he said, his voice soft. "Why's that?" She shrugged, but her smile was a confession. "Reasons." "I'm on board with your reasons." He brushed a kiss against her lips. "I have to do a few things for work this morning. Then I should be off for the rest of the day. Want to meet me in the Sandpiper for brunch in 2 hours? Will there be hash browns? Yes. Then yes." He gave her a wounded look. "There will also be Ridley." This time it was her turn to kiss him. Bonus. He walked her down to her door and headed home to work on his more powerful Mac, determined to fly through his photo edits and submit to his editor in record time. This woman had him wanting to bend and twist time so he could steal more of it with her. He jogged out to his Jeep and slammed it into gear, racing home so he could race back. Oh man, this woman. Brooke couldn't find her phone. It was up on the roof, she realized. Dang. She probably couldn't even get back up there without Ridley's keys. Maybe he was at the concierge desk? She called down. Guest services, Leslie speaking. Hi, Leslie, Brooke said to the perky voice on the other end of the line. Is Ridley working this morning? I'll check for you. Is he at the front desk? Porter services? No, she said, feeling confused. He's a concierge. Really? Short pause. Well, no Ridley here. Thanks. Brooke hung up the phone, wondering how many concierges it took to staff a hotel the size of the Mariposa. She could at least try the roof door herself, and if that didn't work, she'd see if someone from management could get her in. But she wanted to save that for a last resort. She had no idea if Ridley would get in trouble if the bosses knew he'd let guests up there, or even gone up there himself, but she really needed her phone. She took the elevator up to the top floor and followed the corridor around until she recognized the door to the stairs. It opened beneath her hand and she did a fist pump. 1 down, 1 to go. Her luck ran out at the second door. With a curse under her breath, she leaned against it and considered her next move. She could probably do without the phone for another hour or so, but if the office tried to reach her, it would be a problem. She'd have to call in from her room and let them know to reach her there if something came up. She pushed away from the door, relieved she had an option besides ratting out Ridley. When she rounded the corner to head back toward the elevator, she stopped short at the sight of Ridley walking out of one of the guest rooms. She almost called out to him but changed her mind. Something wasn't right. He wasn't in uniform, instead wearing a pair of beat-up cargo shorts and flip-flops, a big camera bag over his shoulder. He walked toward the elevator without glancing back. He was acting a lot more like a guest than an employee. Maybe there was a simple explanation, but other things buzzed around the edges of her memory, like how he never seemed to be on duty, and how no one at the concierge desk ever recognized his name. But why on earth would he have been behind the concierge desk when she checked in if he was a guest here? And if he was a guest, why didn't he want her to know that? That bothered her more than anything. If he was hiding behind that, no reason would be a good reason. She didn't believe in hiding anything, because too often it was a pattern. When people got selective about the facts they shared, she could only wonder what else wasn't coming out. But her medical training led her to seek evidence before drawing conclusions. It didn't take her long to jet back in her room and do a quick Google search, hoping that an uncommon name like Ridley would get her the information she wanted as she typed Ridley plus Seashell Beach into the search bar. The entire first page of results was him, all links to photo essays he had done about surfing. His face, along with some of his work, popped up in thumbnails across the top of the page. And when she clicked a few of them open, they took her breath away. He was incredibly talented. So why was he moonlighting as a concierge? Did he have to fill the gaps between photography jobs with something more stable? But that had been Ridley the guest walking out of the room several floors above her, not Ridley an employee. She walked to her window and stared at the beach, looking southward to where a work crew was disassembling the temporary bleachers from the surf competition. He had to have been shooting that. She went back to her computer and dug into some of the links. His LinkedIn profile identified him as Ridley Lansing, a photographer based in Seashell Beach. It weirded her out to be in possession of his last name when he hadn't given it to her. But it also seemed fair given how much more he knew about her than she did about him. Other links were for industry blogs interviewing him about his technique, and his answers struck her as having the same level of expertise about photography as did the articles she read in her medical journals about plastic surgery. He took his profession seriously. One link led her to a Santa Monica art gallery selling limited edition framed prints of his work, and she gasped at the price tags. If he was selling these even semi-regularly, he definitely didn't need a fallback job like concierge. She sat back down in front of the laptop and scrolled through more of his work. He shot from fearless angles and captured the ocean in light that brought it alive. The more links she clicked on, the more it became obvious that he wasn't just a skilled professional, he was world-renowned. She sat back and stared at the evidence on the screen. A world-renowned photographer who had misled her so she would have no clue. A slow anger kindled in her stomach, a sense of hurt that made her feel madder for feeling it after knowing Ridley for only 3 days. But they had spent real time together, more real than the polite time she'd spent with any of her dates over the last 2 years. She'd gone out with a couple of guys for a few months and connected with them less than she had with Ridley, just by racing him across the Mariposa's lawn, or watching the ocean from the rooftop, and by kissing, and being herself without trying to fit into some neat box. Somehow knowing he would have to stay within the 5 calendar boxes she was spending at the hotel had made it easier for her to simply be herself. She didn't have to think about whether he would misinterpret anything she was saying to mean she wanted a relationship, or worry about impressing him. And so she'd relaxed, been herself, laughed and been spontaneous and made jokes and let him in, because it was easy to do that knowing she'd check out and leave him behind. So why did she care so much about what he'd chosen to reveal or conceal about himself? It would have all ended Tuesday anyway. Today and tomorrow were supposed to be the last adventures before returning to real life. She should go on it anyway, see where the day took her. But the idea had lost its appeal. She stepped out onto her balcony and breathed in the ocean air, trying to figure out why everything suddenly felt different, why she suddenly felt hurt. He'd lied to her, and it was a strange lie, to underplay who he was instead of exaggerating it. Obviously, he'd been keeping her at a distance too. But it was the kind of lie that reminded her of a movie where a prince or a millionaire hides his roots so he can be loved for himself. For all of Ridley's hotness, she didn't think his job, however good he was at it, was enough for him to have to disguise his identity to discourage groupies. She'd put limits on their flirtation by giving it the deadline of her checkout date. It looked like he'd imposed limits by deciding to be someone he wasn't for a few days. It shouldn't hurt. She shouldn't be bothered that he wasn't interested in giving up every piece of his life to a stranger. Before last night, she wouldn't have cared. Much. But to spend hours talking about their childhoods and goals and what they loved and didn't, to feel so connected to someone and find that he hadn't told much of the truth about himself at all. She dropped her head to her forearms resting on the railing and closed her eyes, trying to quiet her thoughts, but one bubbled up over and over again. At some point the night before, she'd mentally erased the last box on her vacation calendar, leaving it open-ended to the possibility of more. And she felt stupid. She was so good at boxes. Time to remember that. She put her feelings in a box so she could handle high-maintenance clients. She put her feelings in a box so she could work on her cleft palate patients and not die a little inside over the ones she couldn't get to. She put her feelings in a box whenever a new guy entered the picture because it was messy to have feelings on the loose. She tucked her feelings back into a box now. Her mom would be upset with her checking out early, but she needed to be at work more than she needed to take an extra vacation day. Even if she spent a day being frivolous in LA to make her mom happy, she had a feeling thoughts of Ridley would intrude, and she would end up fluctuating between hurt and anger all over again. But she'd just proven to herself that both were stupid reactions. Ridley's omissions had ultimately been harmless. It was her own stupid fault for caring that he hadn't felt attracted enough to her to be fully himself, and her own stupid fault that she'd read more into an evening of talking under the stars. And kissing. The kissing. In her defense, she didn't know how someone wouldn't read something into those kisses. The first few kisses by the wishing well had been both curious and hungry, but last night they'd gone from hungry to tender, from a flash fire to a deep burn. Or she'd thought so anyway. She wandered back into her room and set her suitcase on her bed. She didn't need to fall any farther down this rabbit hole. She could still check out without getting charged if she was gone within the hour. She would only need half that. Chapter 8. Ridley pulled back into the Mariposa parking lot and grinned as he swung himself out of the Jeep, his hiking boots hitting the asphalt with a thud. It was stupid how much he wanted to see Brooke, but he didn't care. And when they'd finished their hike, he'd figure out how to convince her that the end of the day couldn't be the end of their connection, whatever it was. He would take more assignments in LA. He needed more of her. He was knocking on her door in record time. When she didn't answer, he pulled out his phone and texted her on his way down to the lobby. She didn't answer, but there was a chance she was sleeping in to make up for a late night, or in the shower so she couldn't hear the knock or text. He stopped by the concierge desk and grinned at Marco. "Can you send something up to room 529 for me?" Marco shook his head. "You the one sending up actor pictures?" "Yeah." "You gonna explain what this is about?" "No." Marco laughed. "Yeah, sure. I'll send one of the boys up. Brent lets you get away with murder around here. And I heard you covered for me. I owe you. Where do you want it this time? Taped to the TV? Stuck on a mirror? Nah, maybe slip it under the door this time so it doesn't disturb her. I'll find one and email it to you to print right now." "Sounds good," Marco said, pulling out an envelope and writing her name on the outside. "Ms. Brooke..." "Dresden," Ridley said. "Is that Brooke with an E?" "I'm not sure," Ridley admitted. "I'll look it up." He clacked on the keyboard and frowned. "We maybe have a problem, buddy." He turned the screen so Ridley could see it. "She checked out this morning." Ridley leaned over and read it without processing it. "She said her reservation was through tomorrow." Marco shrugged. "It was. She checked out a day early. Talk to Lainey at the reservation desk. She might know what's going on." Lainey nodded when she pulled up Brooke's information. "Yes, I checked her out about a half hour ago. She said she forgot about an important meeting at home and needed to take off. Your name is Ridley, right? Room 1427? Yeah. She left a letter for you for when you checked out, but I might as well give it to you now since you're here." She pushed an envelope toward him exactly like the one Marco had been ready to send up to Brooke's room. "We had to send up maintenance to unlock the roof access. Somehow her phone got up there." "Interesting," Ridley said, keeping his expression neutral. "Someone brought 2 lounge chairs up there, too." She was fishing for information, and Ridley didn't blame her. An abandoned phone at a midnight picnic scene, a guy looking for a woman who didn't seem to want to be found, an unexpected letter that was clearly going to blow him off. "Thanks for the letter," he said. "I appreciate it." He slid the envelope into his pocket and walked out of the lobby and away from Marco and Lainey's curious eyes. Hotel staff could sniff out drama better than a surfer could spot a poser on the waves. He didn't blame them for being curious, but he didn't really want to give them any more to discuss. He might as well check out too, and limit the number of times he had to walk through the lobby and avoid their knowing looks. In his room, he sat on the bed and stared at the envelope for a second. Her absence already gnawed at him, an emptiness in his day that he had expected to fill with her, and now it stretched in front of him as one long blank. A few days ago, an open day would have represented freedom and possibility. He glanced through his balcony doors at the gray pall of the marine layer pushing down on the ocean. That seemed about right. He slid her letter from his envelope. Her handwriting on the hotel stationery looked like her, strong and elegant, no curly flourishes. Hi, Ridley. I decided to leave this morning instead of tomorrow because you're Ridley Lansing and you didn't tell me. I'm not really sure why you let me think you were a hotel concierge when I told you all about myself. I Googled you, and you don't have any deep, dark secrets that the internet has discovered, so I'm not sure why you didn't want me to know who you really are. Honestly, I shouldn't care. I know that. But while I had every intention of letting this weekend be the beginning and end of our time together, somehow by this morning I let the edges blur. Blame it on moonlight and wine, but it muddled me into thinking it was real beyond this weekend. I don't want to be all dramatic, but I connected to you like I haven't to anyone in a long time. And the fact that I didn't have good enough instincts to sense that it was a false connection makes me feel stupid. I'm leaving you this note because I'd want to know why someone walked off. I don't have any bad feelings toward you or anything. I should be preserving my dignity and not saying anything at all, just taking off without a word so you'd never know I got turned around on this. But that's not really my style. For better or worse, I'm about no-holds-barred honesty. And frankly, I guess I have enough ego that I wanted you to know I uncovered your secret identity. Let's ignore that it took me much longer to demonstrate critical thinking than it should have. Brooke. Ridley cursed, frustrated at himself. The hours they'd spent talking and laughing last night had taken him right back to high school. 2 days before his senior prom, his date, a girl he'd been going out with for less than a month, had given him a kid's book about this wedge that was going around looking for its missing piece, until it eventually realizes it's part of a wheel, and they're better when they're together, or something like that. His date had written an intense explanation across the 2 pages of the flyleaf about how he was her missing piece, which had led to a disastrous prom night meltdown when he'd had to explain that he thought she was fun, but didn't necessarily see himself as somehow becoming whole because of her. But that's exactly what being with Brooke had felt like. The hollow feeling somewhere between his chest and his stomach felt like a piece of him had been carved out and misplaced. Like Brooke had performed surgery on him and removed something vital. Herself. The worst part was that it was his fault. He could have told her at any point that he didn't work at the hotel, about what he really did. But he hadn't because why? Because that wasn't part of the game plan. To say out loud to her that he wanted her to know who he really was meant making a confession. That he liked her. That he was introducing reality into what should have been a diversion. And he'd thought he didn't want that. That was his buffer. To be only part of himself with her. To withhold so that there was no way the game could turn serious. He'd given up his illusion of distance too late. He'd been so sure his plan to tell her when they went hiking today would magically make everything work out. Man, he was an idiot. How was he supposed to fix this? He reached for his phone to call her, but stopped before he dialed her number. No. If she even answered, she'd probably feel like talk was cheap coming from him, and she had every reason to feel that way. He reached for the hotel phone and made a different call entirely. Chapter 9. Brooke hung up the last dress from her suitcase and stripped down to shower off the residue of a top-down road trip. She couldn't foresee ever giving up her convertible, but there was no question that cruising in it for 3 hours left a thin film of highway on her. Finished and feeling much cleaner, she climbed into a tank top and knit pajama shorts even though it was early afternoon. She was tired enough for bed. She couldn't even blame a lazy drive in the sun for the droopiness. Even after the marine layer had burned off to reveal blue skies, the day had stayed gray to her. She'd gotten Ridley's first text and braced for another one when he figured out she'd left, but no follow-up text ever came. No surprise, really. They were always meant to be done when she was gone. But the grayness inside her had become something more like television static, frenetic and restless. She hadn't left her condo on Thursday thinking she lacked a relationship, but as she glanced around her place, she wondered how she'd missed that everything about it screamed the truth. She was lonely. She was busy filling up her hours and being useful, yes. Useful to the point of thinking she had no room in her life for more. But her coffee maker made single-serve cups, and she only had a love seat because she didn't need a full sofa just for herself. Her tiny cafe table would only fit 2 people if all either of them had was a drink, but only one person could comfortably eat there. She'd thought she was so independent when she'd moved in, proud of herself for being able to afford a Beverly Hills-adjacent property all on her own without needing to decorate around a roommate's or boyfriend's whims. Except it wasn't funny. Now she looked around and it felt sad. How could a place Ridley had never been be so full of Ridley's absence? She'd have to figure out what to do about that, but she had no answers right now. All she had was an overwhelming desire to climb under her blankets and wake up in a day where this weekend was a dream that hadn't happened. Rather than risk a long nap that would screw up her sleep later, she hauled out her laptop and opened her email, smiling when she saw an email from the Nicaragua clinic about Rosa, her all-time favorite patient. She clicked it open and wished she could hug her little friend grinning from the picture the director had attached. Rosa was happy, and before long, Brooke would get to perform the same miracle for dozens of other kids. She couldn't justify spending emotional energy on Ridley when she had this to take care of and worry over. 2 hours later, she'd written up a fairly good overview of what Dr. Benson could expect. She'd spent some time plugging in details throughout the week, but the 8 patient profiles she'd chosen for him were a good start. It washed some of the gray out of the day. She glanced at the time and sighed. Still too soon to go to bed. Instead, she poured herself a bowl of shredded wheat and turned her TV on. A Friday Night Lights rewatch and Tim Riggins were the perfect antidote for her Ridley hangover. She groaned when he crossed her mind again. At least that time she'd pushed him out for a full 2 minutes. A text went off on her phone and she picked it up, squeaking when she saw Ridley's name. She'd been expecting her sister, or even her sassy grandma who had become a texting fool once they'd gotten her the giant iPhone to accommodate her arthritic fingers. She opened the text. "If I knock on your door, am I going to freak you out?" Her heart stuttered and rebounded with an extra hard thump. Was her phone glitching and resending his previous texts? It did that sometimes when she moved in and out of her coverage areas. It just sucked that it had to resend the one text she liked best out of the half-dozen she'd gotten from Ridley. She deleted it and moved on to delete the texts before that. She was on her 4th, finding it satisfying to do them one by one instead of as a batch, when a knock on her door startled a yelp out of her. "Brooke? You okay?" Ridley's voice drifted in through the window she'd left open for the evening breeze. She scrambled out of her seat and opened the door to stare at him on her doorstep. "Hi," he said, his smile wobbling. It melted her a tiny bit. It had been so sure every other time she'd seen it. "Hi." He jingled his car keys and, realizing it, he winced and slid them into his pocket. "I hope showing up like this looks wildly romantic and not borderline psychotic. I'll leave the second you tell me to go." "Do you want me to go?" Her heart stuttered again. The man was practically giving her an arrhythmia. "No," she said, dragging it out the tiniest bit. A flash of worry crossed his face, and he took a step back. "I mean it," she said. "It's okay that you're here. I'm not freaked out, more like totally confused." "Me too. Or I was, but now I'm not. Which is why I promised Brent I would tell the police I hacked into the hotel's customer database to get your address, and not that he gave it to me in case you were mad." "Brent?" "The manager at the Mariposa. We go way back." She nodded, still dazed. "It's fine that he gave it to you. Why did you want it? I mean, why are you here?" "A few reasons. The most important is that I wanted to apologize. I'm sorry I didn't give you the whole picture of me. I know it's easy to say now that I don't have to prove it, but I was going to tell you today when we were out hiking. The fact that you drove all the way down here sort of proves your point. I believe you. Look," she said, glancing behind her. "Do you want to come in?" "Yeah," he said, his smile back at full heartbreaker wattage. "I like that." She led him to the love seat and cursed herself for not getting a full sofa. She didn't feel like squeezing in so close to him while they had this conversation, whatever it might be. She led him to the table instead, and he took a seat. "I like your place," he said, glancing around. "Thank you. I don't have much to offer you. I'm kind of a takeout girl. Do you want some water? Or tea? Or coffee?" She rummaged through a cabinet for tea, wondering if she even had any. Why had she offered him tea? She didn't even drink tea. "I'm fine." Too bad. Now she had no excuse not to sit down. But instead of taking her seat, she leaned against the counter and crossed her feet in front of her. He cleared his throat. "This is so awkward. I'm sorry. But I read your note this morning." She colored, remembering how frank she'd been, not expecting to see him again. "And I felt like I owed you more than an apology text." "You don't owe me anything. It was just a weekend." "No, it was supposed to be just a weekend. That's why—" He broke off, his forehead crinkling, and he looked like he was about to confess to hitting her parked car. "That's why I didn't say what I do for a living. There's a resort culture that happens at hotels like the Mariposa. I worked in it for a long time. I'm still around it pretty often because of all my traveling. And single women who come to resorts tend to fall into a few categories." She frowned, not liking the generalizations she could sense looming. "There are categories for all of the male guests, the married women, the families, for everyone," he said, catching her expression. "I'm explaining the pattern you'll see if you hang out somewhere like the Mariposa a lot." "Is that what you do? Hang out there a lot?" She hated to think of him as someone who sat around trolling the registered guests for women to pick up. She'd like to think she had better judgment than that. "No. I mean, not really. I shoot along that stretch of beach all the time because it draws so many surfers. And I stop into the hotel pretty often to chat with Brent. I knew him because in college I really did used to be a concierge at the same hotel where he was a valet, and I was pinch hitting for him the other day when his regular guy had a family emergency. So for that day, I wasn't faking. But the rest of it? So the categories I mentioned. He cleared his throat and squirmed some more. A lot of the times, single women who are coming to the resort at the same time a conference is happening are looking for a fling. You mean a sugar daddy? She interrupted, giving him credit for at least having the decency to turn a deep red. I'm going to hate everything you're about to say, aren't I? If I were you, I would. She sighed. All right. Let's agree that sometimes women think doctors are an easy meal ticket. Let's agree that some of them are predatory. Let's agree that this is a very, very small minority of women. Completely agreed. But it's a pretty high proportion of the single women who come to the resort. Stipulated. She muttered. I know it's not all the single women, but usually the ones who want solitude don't come to the Mariposa. They go to spa properties, like in Ojai or Sonora. She waved for him to get on with it. I've made it a strict rule not to get involved with women I meet while traveling or who come to the Mariposa. There's no potential there, because even if the connection is amazing, the distance would always be an issue. But sometimes it's fun to flirt. Does that make me sound like a pig? Not if the other person is playing too, I guess. He looked relieved. You caught my eye on the highway. I thought you were local, and I saw at the stoplight that you didn't have a wedding ring on, so I was sitting there wishing I would bump into you around town. And then, when we both pulled into the Mariposa, I couldn't believe I'd lucked out. But right away, it created a conundrum. If you were someone I'd want to date in real life, I needed to stay away from you for the weekend. But if you were superficial, then maybe it would be a fun weekend, done and forgotten by Monday. I know that sounds so calculating, but honestly, I think I can tell when someone's too invested, and I would never lead someone on to entertain myself for a couple of days. Okay, but how are you supposed to figure out if I was a weekend distraction or a true fit? The clock over her stove clicked loudly at least a dozen times before he answered. Before I answer this, I understand that I've been guessing wrong about you from the start. Could I convince you to sign a contract promising you won't hate me for what I say next? You don't need a contract. You'll be fine. It did sound pretty calculating coming out of his mouth this way, but she had an equally analytical mind. If she articulated the way she'd approached most of her dating relationships, it wouldn't sound much better. He'd been practical, and she could understand that. Mainly, though, she believed him when he said he would never take advantage of someone who wasn't interested in the same level of an uncommitted good time. He took a deep breath. So, the single woman at the resort profile. I figured you were there either to snag one of the doctors, in which case I thought it might be fun to see if I could distract you. And if that's not what you were there for, then experience has shown that a lot of the women like flirting with the help. Like Dirty Dancing? Baby and Johnny? He smiled at her disbelief. Yeah, happens all the time. Wait, you know the movie? That surprised her even more. I have 3 sisters. It was on a time or two, or 200, in my house growing up. She nodded. So you were basically seeing if I took the bait, and I did. Nice. I can't believe I confirmed all your awful stereotypes. He dropped his head into his hands and groaned. I kind of hate myself right now. You should kick me out. He scrubbed his hands through his hair and straightened. But I'm never going to assume anything again. I'll let the stories unfold around people. Seems like a less cynical way to deal with the world anyway. I swear I'm cured. She smiled. He was so earnest, like her sister's buy-me-a-puppy face. His shoulders relaxed a fraction when he saw her smile. "I'm not going to kick you out," she said. "I do it too. Spot another doctor at a party and make assumptions. Sum up guys in a single glance. I get it. I probably wouldn't even care except—" She broke off, not wanting to rehash the contents of her note. "Except that I really liked you and I felt stupid. If I'd been able to see you for who you really are, I would have never even talked to you. And I don't mean that as an insult. I mean that I would have known right away that I would get lost in you." He took a deep breath and grew as still as she felt inside, every part of her having drawn a breath she didn't know how to release as she waited an eternity to hear his next words. "I did, Brooke. I got lost in you. Having me here probably makes it feel like you tracked some annoying sand all the way home from Seashell Beach, but I have something else to say besides I'm sorry, and I need to get it out or wonder what if." "What if?" "I swear, everything I told you about myself except my job is true. You saw more of me than you think you did. So what if I told you I feel connected to you in a way I can't explain? I understand if you want to say thanks and move on, but I just couldn't let you think that you were the only one who felt something special." Her insides felt the way the ocean had looked from the hotel roof last night. Kinetic and restless and glinting. But these were flashes of hope, anticipation that wouldn't subside even as waves of common sense tried to swamp it. "Thank you for saying that." She kept her voice neutral. She still wasn't sure what he was doing in her kitchen other than being a stand-up guy. That was a good thing, and she appreciated him for it. But she didn't want that to be the only reason he'd chased her 3 hours down the coast, just so she wouldn't think he was a jerk. Her words made his shoulders tense again, and she realized he'd hoped for a different reaction. He pushed back from the table and walked toward the door. Panic squeezed her insides. She didn't want him to go, but didn't know how to say she wanted him to stay. "Thanks for not calling the cops on me for stalking you," he said. "I'm sorry again I wasn't straight with you." He opened the door. "Wait," she said. "Do you think if I reported you for stalking, it would mean you'd have to stay in town for a day or two?" He turned toward her with a small smile. "Do you think they'd throw me in the Beverly Hills jail? Maybe it's nicer than other jails." "We could find out," she said, her heart pounding. "I don't really want to go to jail, even if it might be a fancy one. But I'd love to hang out with you here. I can't read you, Brooke. You don't seem mad, but I can't tell how you feel." She let out a long breath. Confused. Part of me wants to throw myself at you, and part of me can't figure out the point when you'll have to turn around soon and go on living 200 miles away. It scares me how much I want to pretend like that distance isn't a problem. He dropped his hand from the doorknob and crossed to her in a few long steps, pulling her in for a long kiss, as hot as the first fiery one they'd shared by the well. She moaned and slid her hands around his neck, suddenly desperate to be close to him, wrapped around him, drowning in the taste of him. He slid his hands down her hips, backing her up, lifting her to sit on the countertop so he could step between her knees. He sank deeper into the kiss, and she followed him, loving the feel of the tense muscles in his back and chest, the hard pounding of his heart beneath her palm. She had no idea how long it was before they came up for air, and he rested his hands on the tops of her thighs to run his thumb along the hem of her shorts while he let his breathing even out. He rested his forehead against hers, and she traced his lips lazily, wondering what it was about their shape that made them so good for kissing. I Googled you too, he said after a minute. You were amazing. Did you check my Yelp reviews or something? She said, smiling. Those reviewers are all hoping I'll see them and give them a complimentary Botox injection. I'm talking about smiles from the heart. Why didn't you tell me about that? She shifted in her seat like it had suddenly developed lumps. I don't know. Seems like bragging. I talk about it to people who I'm trying to get to fund it or work for it, but not really anyone else. Hold on, he said, easing away. She whimpered in protest, and he laughed and scooped her up, carrying her like a bride to the love seat, where he set her down with a soft kiss on her lips. I'm going to grab something from my car. I'll be back in a second, I swear. She barely had a minute to think about how crazy her evening had turned out to be when he was back with an iPad in his hand. He sat beside her and repositioned her legs so they lay across his lap. I need to show you some pictures. He swiped through a series of stunning surf photos. These are in Ascencio. That's beautiful. This is near the clinic where I operate. I know. He said it in a way that meant he was waiting for something. She wrinkled her forehead and looked back at the pictures, then at him. What are you? I don't know what you're telling me. I took these pictures. Your website says you're down there next in November. That's an awesome time for surfing. I was thinking I would make that my next trip down too. I haven't shot Nicaragua in 3 years. What do you think? Do you even have time to breathe when you're there for surgery? No. His face fell. She ran her finger across his lips again. I want you to come anyway. Is that selfish? He smiled and drew her fingertip between his teeth to give it a light nip before answering. Yes, I like it. Mostly because I hope it means I get to be selfish too. I think I'm going to start shooting in LA a lot more, and I want to lock up every minute of your free time that you'll give me. He set the iPad on the ground and leaned forward to kiss her again, and she melted into him, tilting her head so he could explore her mouth as she returned the favor. How much free time can I have? He murmured before moving to trail kisses down her neck, each brush of his lips igniting a tiny flame. What if I say all of it? His kiss gave her the perfect answer. This has been Butterfly Kisses, written by Melanie Jacobson, narrated by Andrea Coomer.